Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story you think you know. But surprise, you've probably been wrong about it since grade school. The Middle Ages. That murky, myth-riddled stretch of time where everyone supposedly thought the earth was flat, bathed once per century and got burned at the stake for sneezing in church. Yeah, not quite. And tonight, we're starting with one of the biggest whoppers of all, that medieval people thought the earth was flat. They didn't, not even close. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, what city are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, imagine yourself back in 1320. You're sitting in a monastery in southern England, copying down a manuscript for a travelling scholar. The candlelight flickers over thick parchment, and a nearby cat snuggles into a window ledge. You stretch your back, dip your quill, and glance at a beautiful diagram inked into the margin. A globe. A literal round earth. Because guess what? Educated people, monks, scholars, map makers, they all knew the earth was round. It wasn't a debate. It was, as they would say, common sense. The whole people thought the earth was flat until Columbus sailed the ocean blue myth. That's a 19th century invention. It really picked up steam thanks to writers like Washington Irving, you know, the same guy who gave us the Headless Horseman, who wanted to spice up the Columbus story. Flat Earth versus brave explorer sounded way more dramatic than Columbus miscalculated the circumference of the Earth and stumbled into a continent he didn't understand. I mean, who wants that in a textbook? Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, and even earlier folks like the Venerable Bede understood the Earth was spherical. They inherited that knowledge straight from the ancient Greeks, especially Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with sticks, shadows, and some serious mental gymnastics over 1,000 years earlier. In fact, if you were to walk into the library of any major medieval university, say Bologna or Paris, you'd find celestial globes, star charts, and a lot of Ptolemaic astronomy floating around. Not because they were guessing, but because it worked. Now here's where it gets quirky. While the educated elite understood Earth's roundness, not everyone was reading Aristotle in their spare time. That farmer in the fields? The brewer's apprentice in the next town over? Yeah, they might not have had an opinion either way, but that's not because they were dumb, it's because they were busy surviving plagues, taxes, and being stuck in feudal contracts. Whether the Earth was round or flat didn't exactly change the price of barley. Still, even among the unlettered, there were oral traditions and visual cues. Ships disappearing over the horizon, the curvature of shadows during lunar eclipses. All this reinforced what astronomers already knew. Nobody was falling off the edge of the Earth, and there were 0 dragons waiting to eat you if you sailed too far west. That famous "here be dragons" phrase? Also a myth. It only appears once on a very specific globe from the early 1500s, and by then we're in the Renaissance. But hold on, there was a medieval fringe theory that's worth mentioning, because it sounds just bananas enough to be true. Some theologians, wrestling with the idea of a round Earth, actually debated whether people living on the other side of the globe, the so-called Antipodes, would be reachable or even descendants of Adam and Eve. If they were too far off to be reached by Noah's Ark survivors, were they even human? Did they need saving? This wasn't a geography debate, it was about theology and salvation, and yes, it got a little weird. Then there's the scholarly grey area. How exactly did they think about the shape of the world on a cosmic level? Some medieval models envisioned the Earth as a sphere surrounded by crystalline spheres, rotating heavens and the music of the spheres, an actual concept that they believed in. Where the planets made harmonious tones as they moved. Wild, right? You've got literal harmony in the universe, not sopped TikTok drama. So when people say medieval folks believed in a flat Earth, what they're really doing is projecting 19th century arrogance backward in time. It's a way to make Columbus look braver, make the Enlightenment seem smarter, and erase 1,000 years of perfectly intelligent people who were just figuring things out in their own time. And let's be honest, if aliens landed tomorrow, they'd probably think we were the primitive ones, what with our flat earthers having Facebook accounts. Tonight's big historical fact, medieval scholars overwhelmingly knew the Earth was round, and said so in writing a lot. Your quirky fringe moment, the theological crisis over whether Antipodeans, people on the far side of the globe, counted as human, or so we boosted nonsense, and your scholarly debate. Whether those distant humans could exist at all if they hadn't come from Noah's Ark. For real, that argument lasted centuries. So next time someone says, "Ha ha, medieval people thought the earth was flat," you can gently remind them they've been lied to. Probably by a textbook with a Columbus painting that looks suspiciously like Fabio. Alright, now that we've rolled our eyes at the flat earth myth, let's dip into another dusty little misconception that refuses to die. The idea that medieval people were walking, talking germ colonies who never ever bathed. You've heard it, right? That peasants were caked in filth, nobles stank under heavy velvet, and entire cities reeked like unholy soup. The picture we've all been sold is that medieval folks basically feared water like it owed them money. But, you guessed it, that's totally wrong. Here's the thing. Medieval people loved to bathe. Like, really loved it. They may not have had your cucumber-scented body wash or LED-lit rainfall shower heads, but they knew how to get clean, stay clean, and even enjoy the process. And if you're imagining some grizzled serf splashing his face once a year in a muddy stream, think again. Let's set the scene. It's late afternoon in a bustling medieval town, say Paris around 1250. The streets are noisy, the market's just closing, and you follow your nose past stalls of spices, roasting meat, and warm bread. You duck into a public bathhouse tucked between two stone buildings. Inside, steamy, echoing chambers filled with warm water flickering the torchlight, and the low hum of conversation. People, men and women, are lounging in big wooden tubs, chatting, eating, sometimes flirting. You settle into your own tub, scrub down with soap made from ash and animal fat, and maybe finish with a rinse of rosewater. You leave cleaner than a pre-exam monk's conscience. Yep, public bathhouses were a thing, a big thing. From Constantinople to London, they were wildly popular. They were inspired by Roman baths, sure, but medieval towns had their own take on it. In German-speaking regions, bathhouses were called Badstuben, and in Islamic Spain, hammams flourished with exquisite tilework and well-managed hot water systems. In fact, some bathhouses even had separate rooms for massages, manicures, and, let's call it entertainment, which is probably where this whole myth of baths are sinful got its steam. That's not to say everyone bathed every day. Soap wasn't cheap, hot water took effort, and not every village had the resources. But people still made a point to clean themselves regularly, especially on Saturdays and before major religious festivals. Monasteries even had set schedules for bathing. Some allowed a bath every 2 weeks, others more often. And monks kept their hair and beards trimmed, not just for cleanliness, but as a spiritual discipline. So no, hygiene wasn't an alien concept. It was built into the rhythm of daily life. But wait, if they bathed, why the smelly reputation? Blame the Victorians. Seriously. In the 19th century, English writers and scholars looked back at the Middle Ages through a fog of moral superiority and lavender-scented handkerchiefs. To them, anything pre-industrial was dirty, poor, and uncivilized. They exaggerated filth to make their own era seem more enlightened. And of course, diseases like the Black Death were retroactively blamed on poor hygiene, as if people had willingly skipped soap and invited plague fleas to dinner. Now here's the quirky part. In medieval Europe, there was a belief that bathing opened the pores too much, making the body vulnerable to disease. Some doctors warned that hot baths could let illness in. During plague years, this advice got serious. People still wanted to clean up, but some started switching from full-on baths to dry washing, changing into clean linens, wiping themselves down with cloths, and using herbs like rosemary and lavender to freshen up. So technically, there was a time when people hesitated to bathe, but it wasn't about laziness or stupidity. It was about survival, as they understood it. Here's the scholarly debate. Did people actually stop bathing altogether during and after the plague? Or did the rich just bathe in private while the public bathhouses fell out of favour? Historians are still bickering over this. Some say public baths declined due to fears of disease and morality crackdowns, especially in more conservative regions. Others argue that elite households simply moved their hygiene indoors, while the poor were left without access. Either way, soap-making remained a respected trade, and instructions for body cleaning appear in plenty of household guides right through the late Middle Ages. Now let's talk soap, because yes, they had it. Medieval soap was often made from animal fat and lye, with ash or herbs added in. In Islamic regions, soap was a booming industry, with higher quality than much of Europe's, and it was exported widely. Aleppo soap made with olive oil and laurel, was basically the Chanel No. 5 of the medieval world. And if you think medieval women just walked around greasy and grimy, think again. Hair was washed, perfumes were distilled, and there were even recipes for breath fresheners. Cleanliness wasn't just a preference, it was tied to morality, respectability, and sometimes even erotic appeal. You're not going to find a medieval influence filming their get-ready-with-me bathhouse routine, but you'd find poetry and courtly tales where washing before meeting a lover was expected. Nobody wanted to woo a lady while reeking like goat cheese and desperation. And knights? Those guys were sweating into steel all day. You bet they scrubbed down before entering polite company, or at least before crashing that noble feast. Let's clear the record then. Medieval people were not gross little dirt goblins. They were just as concerned with staying fresh as anyone else. They had access to soaps, scents, bathhouses, and routines that may not meet our standards but were a far cry from the stinkfest we're told about in school. Your hard fact for tonight. Public bathing was common and culturally significant across medieval Europe and the Islamic world. Your quirky bonus, some bathhouses doubled as restaurants and hookup spots, spa night got real. Your open debate. Did hygiene truly collapse after the plague, or just go underground with private luxury? So yeah, next time someone tries to claim medieval folks were allergic to water, you've got receipts. And maybe remind them that deodorant wasn't invented until way later. So let's not throw stones, 1700s France. You're walking through a dusty museum exhibit, tracing your fingers along the glass that separates you from a rusted belt covered in crude iron locks. The sign reads Chastity belt, 17th century. And suddenly your imagination does a backflip. A poor maiden locked up like a lunchbox. A paranoid knight riding off to war with the key dangling from his chainmail. A whole generation of women forced into iron underwear. Sounds brutal, right? And also kind of hilarious in a medieval sitcom way. But here's the twist. This entire chastity belt thing. Mostly a myth. Yeah. Turns out the infamous chastity belt is one of history's juiciest examples of people wanting a story to be true because it's so wonderfully absurd. The idea that men in the Middle Ages were so insecure, so obsessed with control that they strapped their wives into locking metal contraptions before leaving for a crusade, that just feels medieval, doesn't it? But reality says, not so much, let's walk it back. For centuries, scholars believed that chastity belts were invented in the Middle Ages to preserve women's purity. And by purity, of course, they meant fidelity, because medieval men apparently thought their wives couldn't be trusted to keep their legs together for 5 minutes. But when actual historians began looking into the artifacts, examining the metallurgy, the craftsmanship, and the so-called documentation, they found a different story. Most of the chastity belts we see in museums today, total fakes. Many of them date from the 18th and 19th centuries. You read that right. They were either created as curiosities meant to shock and amuse, or were the result of Victorian moral panic. Some were outright jokes. Satirical drawings from the Renaissance show chastity belts with keys the size of a door lock or designed so impractical they'd make movement or urination basically impossible. Others were built centuries later as part of bizarre displays for travelling circuses or museums of torture. And unfortunately, a lot of these props got mislabeled or deliberately passed off as real medieval artefacts. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the myth was so juicy, so enwrenched, that even textbooks couldn't resist. But here's where it gets weird. While chastity belts as physical devices probably didn't exist in medieval Europe the way we picture them, the idea of controlling female sexuality, that was very real. Women were often expected to be loyal, modest, and marriage-ready. Virginity was a currency, especially among the upper classes, where land, wealth, and alliances hung on the sexual reputation of daughters. So no, nobody was handing out padlocked panties, but the surveillance was there, in the form of chaperones, convents, court gossip, and occasionally cloistering. In fact, the earliest known mention of a chastity belt in literature comes from a 15th century Italian satire that clearly mocks the idea. It's played for laughs, not as something anyone actually did. And yes, some upper-class women may have worn protective undergarments while travelling alone, but more for defence against assault than for enforcing fidelity. You wouldn't call a modern travel-safe fanny pack a trust belt, right? Here's the fringe fact for this section. There was a real medieval device known as the braguette, a kind of armoured codpiece for men. Originally designed to protect sensitive areas in battle, it later evolved into a bizarre fashion statement, with some reaching let's say comical proportions. Imagine strutting into court with a steel bulge bigger than your actual helmet. Because if anyone was locking anything up, it wasn't the ladies, it was the knights. Still, the idea of chastity belts survives because it satisfies so many modern biases. It paints the Middle Ages as laughably barbaric. It plays into dark fantasies of oppression, and it gives us this caricature of horny women constantly on the brink of infidelity, only kept in check by cold metal and male control. But like many myths that survive through snarky memes and badly researched history channels, it tells us more about modern anxiety than medieval life. Now here's the scholarly debate. While most experts agree chastity belts are largely mythical, a small number of scholars argue that some may have been used in specific isolated contexts. Maybe as fetish objects, maybe as medical restraints, or maybe, just maybe, as symbolic gifts, never actually worn. The evidence is spotty though. No diaries, no official mentions, no trade records. And given how obsessed medieval clerics were with documenting every sinful twitch of human behaviour, the absence of evidence says a lot. There's even a theory that chastity belts were invented retroactively as a joke at the expense of medieval people, portraying them as both prudish and perverted at the same time, which honestly is how a lot of history gets twisted. Exaggerate something boring into something scandalous, and suddenly everyone's paying attention. So let's be clear. Women in the Middle Ages were definitely policed in ways that were oppressive and patriarchal, but those methods were more subtle. Arranged marriages, inheritance laws, accusations of heresy or witchcraft. Social exile, not iron bloomers. No one was clanking around with keys dangling between their knees. No one had to call a locksmith for date night. Your cold historical fact for tonight? No solid evidence supports widespread use of chastity belts during the medieval period. Your fringe trivia. Men's armoured codpieces were real and sometimes ludicrously exaggerated for fashion and status. And your scholarly debate? Whether a few chastity belts might have existed as symbolic or isolated items, and what that says about the culture that invented the idea if not the object. So next time someone pulls out the old "they locked up their women" line about the Middle Ages, you can sigh, sip your tea and say, actually, that's more Victorian kink than medieval fact. Okay, time for a little mental colour correction. Picture a medieval village or town square. What do you see? If you're like most people, you're probably imagining a washed out scene in 50 shades of mud. Everyone's in a burlap, everything's brown, grey, or some depressed combination of both. The only colour comes from the occasional bright red splash of blood from a sword fight or plague pustule. But here's the reality. The Middle Ages were bursting with colour. Medieval people didn't just like colour, they were obsessed with it. Your image of drab, dirt-stained peasants is mostly a modern invention, brought to you by bad movie lighting and lazy costume design. Let's get one thing straight. If you lived in medieval Europe, your world would be full of colour. Walls were painted, banners waved in every hue imaginable, and clothing, yes, even peasant clothing, was dyed in vibrant tones when materials allowed. Rich blues, bright yellows, deep reds, and lush greens were everywhere, especially during festivals or feast days. Even the poor, who couldn't afford the fanciest fabrics, often wore clothes dyed with cheaper but still colourful plant-based pigments. Woad gave you blue, Weld offered yellow, and madder root could make a solid red. Sure, you might not be walking around in royal purple unless you had a noble title and a serious coin purse, but wearing colour was normal. It was the default, not the exception. That whole brown sack thing. It's more about 20th century filmmakers trying to quickly convey the past than historical accuracy. Costume designers in the 50s weren't sitting around researching plant-based dye techniques or reading medieval laundry records. They just slapped a potato sack on an actor and called it a day. And now, decades later, your brain still thinks the past was beige. Now let's take a little stroll through a noble's wardrobe. You're in a manor house in Burgundy, and your host, a baroness with a taste for drama, throws open a carved wooden chest. Inside, silk imported from Byzantium, deep blue robes dyed with lapis lazuli, which, by the way, was more expensive than gold, a cloak lined with fur, and embroidered dresses with literal gold thread. Colour was a status symbol, and the brighter and more intense the hue, the more wealth it implied. That's why sumptuary laws were a thing, rules designed to restrict who could wear what colours or fabrics based on class. Yeah, that's right. Fashion policing is older than TikTok. But it wasn't just the nobles showing off. Even working class people used colour to express themselves. Sure, their dye choices were more limited, and their fabrics coarser, mostly wool or linen, but they still had pops of vibrancy, a green tunic for market day, a red hood for warmth, a bright belt or hat to stand out during a festival. People didn't wear the same outfit every day either. Even if your wardrobe was small, you'd rotate what you had, patch what you loved, and dye older garments anew when they faded. And here's a fun, quirky little detail. Medieval people were into symbolic colour meanings too. Red wasn't just red, it symbolised power, love, or sometimes sin. Blue was associated with purity and the Virgin Mary. Green could mean fertility or youth, but too much green, that was suspicious, like suspiciously pagan. And black, interestingly enough, wasn't always about mourning. It could represent elegance, gravity, or scholarly pursuits. Basically, your outfit was your Instagram caption. One of the most vibrant pieces of evidence we have about medieval love of colour? Illuminated manuscripts. These books weren't just about the text, they were mini explosions of art. Margins crammed with jewel-toned vines, flowers, birds, and often the occasional naked guy fighting a snail, don't ask. The paints used in these books came from crushed gemstones, rare minerals, and exotic trade goods. That monk hunched over a desk wasn't just copying scripture, he was mixing colours like a Renaissance Bob Ross. And that brings us to a little scholarly rabbit hole. Were the colours of medieval life really that bright? Or have they just survived better in art? Some historians argue that fabric dyes faded fast in the sun and through washing, so people looked more muted and day to day. Others push back, pointing to surviving garments that still show vivid colours centuries later. The truth is probably in the middle. Life wasn't a cartoon, but it definitely wasn't the Dust Bowl we've been led to believe. Here's something else to chew on. City festivals, religious processions and tournaments were full-on colour riots. Imagine a May Day celebration with streamers, painted wagons, dancers in garlands and dyed cloth fluttering from every rooftop. Or a cathedral interior, not the cold grey stone you see today, but walls and ceilings painted in bold patterns and saintly scenes. Yup, most medieval churches were painted inside and out. That soft, faded Gothic stone, that's the naked, weather-worn version. In its heyday, it looked like someone handed a toddler a paint set and just let them go wild in the holiest way. So why does the myth of medieval drabness persist? Partly because many buildings and garments haven't survived in their original form. Textiles rot, dyes fade, paint peels. What we're left with are ruins, skeletons of colour, and a lot of black and white woodcuts from the early printing days. It's like watching a Technicolor movie in grayscale and assuming that's how it was filmed. Tonight's historical fact: medieval clothing and art were richly colourful across all classes, and colour was used deliberately and symbolically. Your quirky side note? Medieval monks made paints from lapis lazuli, bugs and even snail shells to decorate their manuscripts. And your open scholarly debate: were the Middle Ages visually vivid day to day, or was the colour mostly for special occasions and sacred spaces? So next time someone says the past was brown and boring, you can shake your head and say, nah, they were living in full colour before it was cool, just without the filters. Let's slide into another classic myth with the subtlety of a bard with a hangover. That the Middle Ages were one long, uninterrupted slump called the Dark Ages. Like pitch black. Bureaucrats, no science, no literacy, just 1,000 years of plague, pitchforks, and peasant grunting. Sounds dramatic, right? Conveniently terrible. But here's the truth. The Dark Ages weren't dark, not like that. They were complex, colourful, see last section, and full of innovation. The idea that the lights just went out for a millennium, that's a narrative built by people who desperately wanted to believe the Renaissance invented everything from scratch. Spoiler, it didn't. So where does the term Dark Ages even come from? It was cooked up by Renaissance scholars who thought they were the main characters of history. These guys, your Petrarchs and your Da Vinci fanboys, looked back at ancient Rome, saw all the glorious temples, togas and clever Latin phrases, then looked at the ruins around them and went, yikes, must have been a mess back there. So they slapped the label dark on the previous batteries to make their own era seem like a glorious rebirth. That's some top-tier historical marketing. But the real medieval period, from roughly the 5th to the 15th century, wasn't a cultural void. It was more like a messy teenage phase. Awkward, yes, but also full of growth. New languages formed. New political systems emerged. Architecture transformed from Roman leftovers to soaring Gothic cathedrals that still leave tourists slack-jawed today. Ever seen Notre Dame in Paris or the Duomo in Florence? That's medieval work. Baby, not some post-Roman afterthought. Let's talk science for a second. The Middle Ages gave us universities, eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, and windmills. People were studying astronomy, medicine, algebra, and philosophy. The Islamic Golden Age, overlapping with the European Middle Ages, produced genius scholars like Avicenna and Alhazen, whose medical texts and optical theories made their way to European scholars and got used for centuries. The fact that we even have Aristotle's writings today, that's thanks to medieval Arab translators and Christian monks scribbling away in candlelit libraries. And literacy, while sure, not everyone could read, same as now, depressingly, monasteries, cathedral schools, and eventually universities were churning out educated folks like it was a second job. By the 12th century, you could walk into Paris and find debates about metaphysics, grammar, and theology happening over wine and bread. Real barstool philosophy. The stereotype of the toothless, illiterate serf drooling on a rock. Total caricature. Here's a strange little fact for you. During this dark time, people were experimenting with flying machines. Yeah, in 875 CE, a man in Cordoba named Abbas ibn Firnas supposedly strapped on a set of wings and jumped off a hill. He survived, kind of. It wasn't graceful, and the landing was less bird of prey and more falling goat, but still, someone tried. Aviation, Middle Ages style. Not exactly the narrative you'd expect from an era known for alleged scientific dormancy. Now, to be fair, there were periods of collapse. When Rome fell in the west, infrastructure did crumble in places. Cities shrank, trade slowed. And yes, there were times when literacy dipped, especially outside monastic centres. But calling that entire millennium dark is like saying your whole day is ruined, hey, because you spilled your coffee at 7 AM. Civilizations don't stop existing just because they're not currently inventing smartphones. Here's where the scholarly debate gets heated. Some historians want to scrap the term Dark Ages entirely, arguing that it's loaded, Eurocentric, and wildly inaccurate. Others argue we can still use it carefully to describe specific regions or time periods where cultural or economic regression actually did occur, like the very early medieval period in some parts of Western Europe. But nobody worth listening to is still out here calling the entire medieval era a historical void. It's just not true. Want to know something even more ironic? The Renaissance folks who mocked the Middle Ages for being backward were themselves using medieval knowledge to fuel their so-called rebirth. They copied medieval manuscript techniques. They relied on medieval translations. And some of the most important Renaissance thinkers, like Thomas More or Erasmus, were educated in institutions that had been running since the 11th or 12th century. That's like pretending you invented electricity while standing in Edison's workshop. And let's not forget about art. Sure, medieval paintings might look a bit wonky to modern eyes. Floating babies with grown men faces, strange proportions, a lot of intense halos. But those works were part of a visual language built on symbolism, not realism. They weren't trying to recreate what you saw, they were creating an emotional or spiritual world. It was only later that people got obsessed with vanishing points and perfect shading. And even then, those techniques were slowly evolving out of the work done by medieval artists, experimenting with depth and light. So why does the myth stick around? Because it's neat. It divides history into tidy little chapters. Antiquity, then a big dumb pause, then a glorious Renaissance. It flatters modern sensibilities and gives us a simple hero's journey arc for humanity. But real history is tangled. Progress doesn't move in straight lines, and sometimes it happens in dimly lit scriptoriums, not shiny marble halls. Tonight's historical fact: the Middle Ages were full of intellectual, scientific and artistic progress, not a 1,000-year brain freeze. Your quirky gem? A medieval man in 9th century Spain tried to fly using homemade wings. It went about as well as you'd expect. And your scholarly debate: should we retire the phrase Dark Ages entirely? Or can it still be useful when carefully applied? So no, the Middle Ages weren't dark. They were shadowed, layered, occasionally chaotic, but never lifeless. If anything, they were just a little misunderstood, like every good protagonist in a coming-of-age movie. Let's tackle another medieval misconception that refuses to die, probably because it fits so nicely into modern clickbait. The average medieval person only lived to 30. Boom, brutal, and game over by your third grey hair. It's a favourite stat for shocking middle schoolers and convincing people the past was nothing but pain, disease and funerals. But just like that people thought the Earth was flat thing, this one's misleading to the point of being useless. So tonight, we're putting that myth in the ground, gently, respectfully, and definitely not at age 29. So here's what's actually going on. When you hear average life expectancy was 30, you're hearing a statistical average, not a cap on how long people lived. That number is dragged dramatically downward by one huge factor: infant and child mortality. A lot of babies didn't survive past their first birthday. A lot of toddlers didn't make it past 5. You can thank disease, lack of medical knowledge, and poor sanitation for that. And if you were a woman giving birth, you rolled the dice every single time. Pregnancy was not exactly a wellness journey in the 1300s. But here's the twist. If you made it through those treacherous early years, you had a solid shot at living into your 50s, 60s, or even beyond. Especially if you were reasonably well fed, avoided plagues, and didn't get caught in the wrong end of a baron's tantrum. There are countless records of people living long, productive lives. Nobles, monks, farmers, merchants. Once you survived childhood, you entered what scholars call a normal life curve, not a cliff edge at 29. Let's take a little time-travelling stroll through a medieval town. You're walking down a narrow street in York in the late 14th century. The baker, probably in his 40s. His mother, inside tending the fire, 60s and grumpy about your muddy boots. Across the way, a group of older women are spinning wool and chatting. One of them lost 2 babies to illness, but lived to see her granddaughter married. These people aren't ghosts, they're real. Their stories were just overshadowed by statistics that don't tell the whole truth. Now, of course, some groups had it harder. Serfs and peasants doing back-breaking labour, people exposed to war, and folks living in dense cities with poor sanitation faced constant risks. But even they didn't just keel over at 30. Chroniclers recorded folks living into old age. There are abbots in their 80s, monks working into their 70s, and peasants proudly mentioned in local records for their long years of service or surprisingly stubborn longevity. One English legal document from the 13th century mentions a tenant farmer who outlived 3 generations of landlords. Here's your quirky fact for this section. Medieval people actually had a word for the different stages of life, sometimes breaking human existence into 7 ages, like a very serious horoscope. These ranged from infantia, babyhood, to senectus, old age. And the idea was that life progressed in predictable, meaningful phases. Think medieval life planner. You weren't just born, worked and dropped dead. You aged, changed roles, gained wisdom, and people respected that. Grey hair wasn't something to die away, it was a sign you'd made it. Of course, life was still hard. Disease was always looming, and medicine ranged from surprisingly herbal and effective to please stop putting leeches on me. War, famine and plague could absolutely end a life prematurely. And let's not pretend people had the benefit of modern dental care. You might make it to 60 with your jaw intact, but your teeth might be making their own quiet exit. Still, if we're talking about whether medieval people could live long lives, yes, they absolutely could and did. One major factor was diet. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people weren't just eating dirt, stew and crying into dry bread. A balanced diet of grains, legumes, vegetables, fish, and occasional meat helped many stay relatively healthy, at least by their standards. And seasonal fasting, guided by the church calendar, may have had unexpected benefits. Less gluttony, more plant-based meals, and the occasional digestive break. Not exactly paleo, but maybe adjacent. Now the scholarly debate. Historians argue over how accurate age records really are. Church records, tax rolls, and legal documents sometimes recorded approximate ages or rounded numbers. So when someone's described as very old, is that 60 or 85? Some records may exaggerate longevity to add gravitas, like saying an elder was nearly 100, when that may just mean super old for this village. But archaeology has helped bridge that gap. By studying bones and teeth from medieval cemeteries, researchers can estimate age at death with growing precision, and the data backs it up. People lived past 30 a lot. There's also some disagreement over how aware people were of their own ages. Birthdays weren't a big deal like they are now, especially among common folk. You didn't have a cake with your name on it and someone screaming, "You're 30!" while throwing glitter. More often, your age was tied to events, harvests, marriage and marriages. major battles. You'd say things like, "I was a boy when the old king died," and everyone would nod. Time moved differently, but it was still marked. So let's revise that awful headline. Medieval life expectancy at birth was around 30 because babies died a lot, not because people aged like avocados. Once you made it out of those risky early years, you could have a long, full, messy, occasionally plague-interrupted life. Tonight's verified fact: life expectancy at birth was low due to high infant mortality, not because adults keeled over in their 30s. Your quirky tidbit: medieval scholars categorized life into 7 stages, including a kind of retirement phase for storytelling and wisdom sharing. And your scholarly debate? How accurate were reported ages in medieval documents? And can we really trust all those "I live to 100" claims? So the next time someone tells you medieval people died at 30, feel free to roll your eyes like a grumpy abbot and say, "Sure, if they got eaten by wolves as toddlers." Alright, time to strike a match on another medieval myth that refuses to die quietly. That witches were burned at the stake all across Europe during the Middle Ages, like it was some kind of national sport. Yes, it's a dramatic image. Bonfires blazing in every village square, innocent women screaming in agony while chanting monks look on smug and satisfied. The problem is that whole scene. It's more early modern horror than medieval fact. Sure, there were accusations, and sure some folks got torched, but the massive witch-burning frenzy that people imagine, that came after the Middle Ages. And it says a lot more about the paranoia of the 16th and 17th centuries than about medieval theology. Let's rewind to, say, the year 1250. You're standing in a bustling town square in France. There's a juggler doing something vaguely dangerous with knives, a friar handing out tracts about the dangers of pride, and a woman in a red cloak selling hot pies. Nobody's being burned for witchcraft. In fact, if someone accuses a neighbour of being a witch, the local church court is likely to dismiss it as superstition. That's right, the church didn't take witchcraft seriously for most of the medieval period. In many cases, they literally said it was nonsense. No joke. Early canon law called belief in magic a delusion of the devil. As in, if you thought someone could fly on a broomstick or curse your goats, you were the problem. Authorities didn't deny that weird stuff happened, but they chalked it up to illusion, ignorance, or demonic trickery. They were more concerned with heresy, actual theological rebellion, than with old women mumbling in Latin over herbs. So how did we get from mild skepticism to full-blown witch hunts? Blame the printing press. Okay, not entirely, but it helped. In the late 15th century, right as the Middle Ages were wrapping up, 2 German inquisitors wrote a book called Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. It was basically a how-to guide for finding, torturing, and executing witches. It was wild, misogynistic, paranoid, and very, very popular. It took off in the early modern period just as Europe was going through waves of war, religious upheaval, and plague-induced panic. People were looking for someone to blame, and the Malleus helpfully pointed to that weird woman down the road. The real witch-burning craze took place between the 15th and 18th centuries after the medieval era ended. Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France saw some of the worst. And just to make things more confusing, it wasn't just the church driving the hunts. Secular courts were often just as involved, and sometimes even more brutal. In Protestant areas, accusations flew just as freely as in Catholic ones. So this wasn't about medieval theology. It was about mass hysteria mixed with deeply entrenched sexism. Now here's an unquirky wrinkle. During the High Middle Ages, people were way more likely to accuse you of being a heretic than a witch. If you said the wrong thing about the nature of Christ or denied a church doctrine, trouble. But stirring a potion to ease your neighbour's cough? That was often just called healing. Wise women, midwives, herbalists, they weren't automatically seen as evil. They were often trusted members of their communities. Superstition, yes, but not witch panic. Also, burning wasn't even the default punishment. When heresy or sorcery was punished during the medieval period, the methods varied. Hanging, banishment, penance, these were more common. Burning was usually reserved for major theological crimes or symbolic executions. And even then, it wasn't a constant thing. There were decades, even whole centuries, where barely anyone was executed for anything resembling witchcraft. Here's where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Some historians argue that the seeds of the witch craze were planted in the late Middle Ages, even if the bonfires hadn't started yet. They point to shifting attitudes in the church, growing obsession with demonic pacts, and a slowly developing suspicion of female healers. It's a bit like watching a thunderstorm build. There are early rumbles, but the real lightning show doesn't hit until later. Others argue that the Middle Ages actually served as a stabilising force, with the Church's sceptical stance preventing mass hysteria for centuries. Then once that stance loosened in the early modern era, all bets were off. Now for tonight's strange but true moment. There's documented evidence that some accused witches defended themselves in court by saying they didn't work with demons, they just used knowledge passed down through generations, and sometimes that actually worked. Local judges or clergy would shrug and decide, "Alright, fine, keep your herbs, just don't talk about flying pigs or making love potions for married men." Justice was inconsistent, but it wasn't automatically a death sentence. We also can't ignore how gender played into this. Women, especially older, single or widowed women, were disproportionately targeted during the later witch hunts. But again, during most of the medieval period, these women weren't running from torch-wielding mobs. They were often sought out for their skills. There was fear, yes, but also respect. The idea of the village witch as a scapegoat really gains momentum much later. So let's be clear, the Middle Ages weren't free of violence, superstition or misogyny. But the classic image of endless witch burning? That's revisionist theatre. It makes for dramatic stories but erases the nuance of an era that was more sceptical and layered than we give it credit for. Tonight's historical fact. The large-scale witch hunts and burnings mostly occurred after the medieval period in the early modern era. Your fringe nugget. The Malleus Maleficarum, basically a witch-hunting manual, was published in 1487, right at the end of the Middle Ages, and the scholarly debate, did late medieval shifts in theology and superstition lay the groundwork for later witch hunts, or was the medieval church actually a moderating influence? So the next time someone invokes the Middle Ages like it was one big haunted bonfire, just lean back, raise an eyebrow and say, "You're about 200 years too early, my friend." Let's clear out the spice cabinet and take a big whiff of another half-baked myth, that medieval food was bland, boring and basically punishment for having taste buds. You know the story, gruel for breakfast, mystery meat for lunch and more gruel for dinner. No flavour, no variety and absolutely no spices, because, well, apparently everyone before the Renaissance was too busy dying young to bother with seasoning. But here's the thing, that's total nonsense. Not only was medieval food not bland, it was shockingly flavourful, sometimes intensely spiced, and brace yourself, it would probably blow your modern palate sideways. Picture this. You're seated at a long wooden table in a 14th century noble household. The tapestries are pulled tight against the chill, and the smells wafting from the kitchen are complex, spicy and rich. Cooks are busy preparing roasted game birds with sauces made from wine, vinegar, cinnamon, ginger and saffron. There's stewed fruit with cloves and nutmeg. There's fish delicately poached in almond milk. This isn't a survival menu. This is high art on a plate. Let's be real. Medieval cooks were obsessed with spices. They didn't just use them, they flaunted them. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, black pepper, ginger, galangal, long pepper, even grains of paradise, which sounds like something from a fantasy game but was very real and very spicy. These ingredients were imported from Asia and Africa and cost a small fortune, so to pile them onto a roast or a pie wasn't just about flavour, it was vexing. Spicing your food in medieval Europe was like driving a gold-plated chariot through your dinner party. You didn't use spices because you had to, you used them because you could. Now, before you accuse medieval people of using spices to cover up the taste of rotten meat, that's another stubborn myth that needs to be yeeted into the moat. Meat was expensive, no one was letting it rot and then trying to salvage it with a few sprinkles of cinnamon. Not only would that be disgusting, it would be incredibly inefficient and dangerous. People had salting, smoking, drying and pickling techniques to preserve food. Spices were for flavour, not food CPR. Even peasants, while not swimming in saffron, had flavourful diets. A typical meal for a commoner might include hearty pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes a bit of meat or fish. Herbs like parsley, sage, thyme and dill were common. Garlic and onions were everywhere. People baked their own bread, often sourdough-like loaves, churned their own butter, and brewed their own ale. And no, they weren't just eating grey sludge. A well-made pottage with leeks, carrots, barley, and a dash of garden herbs could be absolutely delicious. And let's talk about sauces. Oh boy, medieval folks loved a sauce. Sauces made from wine, vinegar, fruit puree, breadcrumbs, and, you guessed it, spices. A noble's banquet might include roasted swan with a sharp, acidic black pepper sauce or rabbit in a sweet and sour plum concoction. These flavour profiles were complex and unexpected, often balancing sweet with savoury, sour with spicy. If you're thinking, wait, that sounds kind of like modern Asian cuisine, you're not wrong. The palate was more globally influenced than you'd expect. Here's something quirky. There were entire cookbooks in the Middle Ages, real ones. The form of curry, compiled by the cooks of King Richard II in the 14th century, includes recipes for elaborate dishes that wouldn't be out of place in a five-star restaurant. If you could get past the occasional peacock served with its own feathers reattached for flair. That's not a joke. Presentation mattered. Food was theatrical. Sometimes dishes were dyed with saffron or beetroot for dramatic colour, or layered in gold leaf just because. And yes, people did eat peacocks, swans and porpoises if they were rich and wanted to impress. But everyday folk weren't just gnawing on twigs. They had access to seasonal vegetables like cabbage, turnips, beans, peas and parsnips. Apples and pears were everywhere. Nuts, berries and honey sweetened things naturally, and don't underestimate medieval baking. Pies and pastries were incredibly popular, filled with meat or fruit, depending on the season and your budget. Street vendors even sold hand pies to passers-by. That's right, medieval hot pockets. Now here's the scholarly wrinkle. While medieval recipes were full of flavour, many of the surviving cookbooks were aimed at the upper classes, so some historians argue that our picture of medieval cuisine is skewed toward luxury. Peasant diets were certainly simpler, more grain-heavy, and sometimes repetitive. But that doesn't mean they were flavourless. Foraging, home gardens, community ovens, and local knowledge made even humble food satisfying. And don't forget, taste is cultural. A peasant stew might taste boring to you, but comforting and complex to them. Plus, they had ale to wash it down. Want a truly fringe moment? In some places, cooks used edible ink to stamp designs onto food. They'd use little hand-carved stamps to press patterns onto pastry or bread before baking. It wasn't just about calories, it was about beauty. These people were into edible aesthetics long before Instagram made it mandatory. Another fun twist. Medieval fasting days, which happened a lot, didn't mean bland food. They just meant no meat or dairy. So people got creative with fish, almond milk, oil-based sauces, and fake meats made from crushed nuts or legumes. Medieval Lent was basically an episode of Chopped. You have no cheese, no meat, and 47 eels. Go. So no, medieval food wasn't a punishment. It was flavourful, dynamic, often experimental, and occasionally extra to the point of absurdity. If anything, the real crime is that we've turned that legacy into a sad beige porridge joke. Tonight's historical fact: medieval cuisine used a wide variety of spices and flavour combinations, especially among the upper classes. Your quirky moment? Some medieval cooks used stamps and edible ink to decorate food, proto-foodie art, and the scholarly debate. Are our perceptions of medieval flavour based too heavily on elite cookbooks, or does enough evidence support a broader, spiced-up picture? So next time someone calls medieval food bland, ask them when they last cooked, with grains of paradise and saffron. Then offer them some eel pie. See how committed they are to history. Now let's suit up, literally, and talk about one of the most over-glorified, over-sanitized, and often completely misunderstood figures of the medieval world, the knight. You know the image: gleaming armour, pure heart, chiseled jaw, defender of the helpless, slayer of dragons, upholder of chivalry and virtue. Basically a walking Pinterest board for medieval masculinity. But peel back the layers of plate armour and you'll find something a little more complicated, and often a lot more gross. Because the truth is, knights weren't always noble. Sometimes they were glorified thugs with a taste for violence, a questionable grasp on morality, and a tendency to cause more problems than they solved. Let's start with the basics. Being a knight in the Middle Ages wasn't just about being brave, it was a job, a military profession. And for much of the period, knights were more like freelance war contractors than noble paragons. They trained in combat from boyhood, served under lords and fought in battles, sure, but they also raided, pillaged, extorted, and generally made life difficult for anyone who lived along the roads they travelled. And while there was a code of chivalry, emphasis on code, not law, a lot of knights treated it more like a suggestion. A knight might swear to protect the innocent, and then turn around and torch a village that refused to pay protection money. Take the 12th and 13th centuries, for example. Europe was crawling with robber knights, petty lords who used their castle positions to control roads, bridges and trade routes, and then squeezed travellers for tolls or just outright robbed them. It was less defender of the realm and more highway bandit in shiny pants. You could be a knight and still be excommunicated by the church for your behaviour. You could even be excommunicated twice if you were especially spicy. So where did the noble knight image come from? Blame the poets. Starting in the 11th century, romantic literature swept across Europe, painting knights as gallant lovers, protectors of women and defenders of virtue. Think Lancelot, Gawain, and all those Arthurian tales filled with magic swords and dramatic sighs. These stories were popular because they offered an idealised version of knighthood, something to aspire to. But in real life, Lancelot would probably have been too busy managing his landholdings, or bullying peasants to write poetry about a forbidden love affair. And it's not just the literature that made knights look good. The church had a vested interest in giving knights a makeover. These were violent men in a violent world, and the church was always trying to direct that violence somewhere useful, like, say, the Holy Land. The concept of holy war, especially the Crusades, offered a neat little outlet. Kill for God earned salvation, sin erased. Your sword now had a divine purpose, and suddenly all that blood on your hands looked a lot more holy. Here's a fun little fact. Knights used blunt weapons like maces or warhammers as often as swords do, especially against other armoured opponents. Forget the elegant duel, medieval combat was brutal, loud and messy. You weren't dancing with your opponent, you were trying to crush their ribcage through steel. And speaking of steel, those shining suits of armour, not that practical outside the battlefield. Most knights preferred padded gambesons or chainmail for everyday violence. Full-plate armour was expensive, high maintenance and heavy. Not that you'd be immobile in it, another myth. But you weren't wearing it to breakfast either. Now, let's talk about tournaments. These weren't polite sporting events where everyone clapped and drank mead. Early tournaments were chaotic, full-contact, multi-night melees that were basically legally sanctioned brawls. People died, horses were stolen, helmets were filled with teeth. It was only later, in the 14th and 15th centuries, that jousting became a more formalised, pageantry-filled display of knightly virtue. Earlier on, it was a chance for young knights to gain experience or lose an eye. And here's the quirky bit. Knights were also kind of the influencers of their day. Nobles loved showing off their wealth through heraldry, tournaments and finely crafted armour. Having a lavishly decorated shield or a ridiculous feather plume was like having a verified Instagram account. Some knights even had publicists, chroniclers who would sing their praises, write their adventures, and polish their reputations for posterity. Not unlike certain billionaires today, some knights worked very hard to look noble while quietly behaving like absolute gremlins. This brings us to the scholarly grey area. How chivalrous were knights, really? Some historians argue that the chivalric code, emphasising honour, mercy and defence of the weak, was genuinely internalised by many knights, especially those educated in courtly traditions. Others say that chivalry was mostly PR, an ideological leash that nobles wore to justify their power and violence. The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Some knights really did try to live up to the ideals, others saw those ideals as a tool, something to flash when it benefited them and ignore when it didn't. And not to be overlooked, there were female knights, or at least women who functioned in knight-like roles. They weren't always formally dubbed, but noble women sometimes led troops, held castles and fought in sieges. Ever heard of Nicolas de la Haye? She defended Lincoln Castle against multiple attacks in the early 13th century. Some orders, like the Order of the Hatchet in Spain, even honoured women who fought to defend their towns. So no, knighthood wasn't exclusively a testosterone club. Tonight's historical fact, not all knights were noble heroes. Many were violent landowners or enforcers with flexible morals and very real body counts. Your quirky detail? Knights weren't above hiring scribes to write glowing accounts of their exploits. Medieval hype men, basically. And the scholarly debate? Was chivalry a genuine behavioural code, or just elite propaganda to make warlords look polished? So next time someone calls someone a real knight in shining armour, ask the storybook version, or the one who extorted merchants and cracked skulls at the county fair. Let's talk about the peasants. Those humble, hay-scented folks you've seen 1,000 times in movies and textbooks, faces smudged with dirt, backs permanently bent, toiling away and belted with the hopelessness of medieval Eeyores. They are usually portrayed as sad, illiterate drones with no rights, no hope, and nothing to do but farm and die. But here's the twist you probably didn't see coming. medieval peasants weren't powerless. In fact, in a lot of cases, they had more agency than you think, and some of them knew exactly how to throw down when things got unfair. Let's rewind to a modest English village in the early 14th century. You're a peasant named Tom, yes, with an H, and you're not a slave, you're a villain, which means you owe your lord certain duties. A few days of labour, maybe a portion of your harvest of mould. But you also have rights, you have access to land, you can marry, raise animals, collect firewood, and, this is key, you can take your grievances to court. That's right, you can sue your neighbour for stealing your sheep. You can even challenge your lord in manorial court if he tries something shady. The law wasn't just for nobles, it was local, and surprisingly inclusive when it came to disputes among the lower classes. Now, does that mean life was easy? Oh, not even close. You worked dawn to dusk, lived in cramped houses with animals snoring underfoot, and prayed you wouldn't get hit with famine, plague, or a lord with an attitude. But the idea that peasants were all helpless pawns, not true. They were part of a structured system that gave them responsibilities, but also protections, and when things got out of hand, they organised. Case in point, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. You've got this tax, called the poll tax, slapped on everyone regardless of income. Cue outrage. People from villages and towns rise up, march on London, and demand an audience with King Richard II. Their leader, Wat Tyler, isn't some unthinking brute. He's articulate, bold, and clear on what they want. Abolition of serfdom, fair wages, and justice. And for a moment, it looks like they'll win. Until, of course, the king's men panic, Tyler gets stabbed, and the rebellion collapses. But the message, loud and clear, peasants were done being treated like disposable labour, and they didn't go quietly. This wasn't a one-off. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were numerous uprisings and labour disputes. In Germany, in Italy, and France, peasants knew how to organise, riot, and make their voices heard, and they weren't just swinging pitchforks. They had political demands, grievances, and a desire to shape their own lives. Sound familiar? It's the medieval version of a union strike, just with more wool cloaks and fewer hashtags. Here's your quirky fact for the night. Peasants sometimes formed communes, not the modern kind with kombucha and drum circles, but legal associations that gave them collective bargaining power. Towns would swear mutual oaths of defence and self-governance. They'd form militias. Some even negotiated charters from their lords that granted them semi-autonomy. In other words, medieval peasants had their own version of local government. You didn't need a castle to play the politics game. And speaking of politics, some peasants became wealthy. Yep, social mobility. Another thing people assumed didn't exist in the Middle Ages. But it did, albeit slowly and unevenly. A clever, hard-working peasant might accumulate enough land or wealth to join the ranks of the yeomanry, free men who weren't tied to a lord and often served as local leaders. Some became bailiffs or reeves, overseeing land and managing resources, and some bought their freedom outright, especially after the Black Death. When labour shortages gave workers more leverage, you want someone to till your land after half the village died. Better offer fair wages, buddy. Now this brings us to the scholarly grey zone. How free were medieval peasants, really? Some historians argue that we overstate their agency. After all, they were still tied to the land, subject to local lords and bound by customs they didn't choose. Others point out that medieval life wasn't static. Customs evolved, rights were negotiated. The peasant experience varied wildly depending on where and when you lived. In England, the decline of feudalism gave rise to a more mobile peasantry. In Eastern Europe, serfdom tightened. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. What's clear is that peasants weren't just grunting background extras, they were the economic backbone of society. Growing the food, raising the animals, building the towns, and they weren't passive. They complained, they bargained, they took each other to court, formed alliances, and occasionally told their lords where to stick it. Not bad for a group history textbooks usually reduced to dirty people with hoes. Also fun detail, peasants had festivals, lots of them. Religious feasts, saints' days, harvest celebrations, excuses to take a break, drink, dance, and wear flowers in your hair. Life wasn't one long-suffering montage. It had rhythms, joys, social bonds. People sang songs, told stories, gossiped, flirted, and got very drunk on homemade ale. And for a few days every year, the whole village might stop working to parade a goat around wearing ribbons. You haven't lived until you've seen a medieval goat in a hat. Tonight's hard fact: medieval peasants had legal rights, social structures, and sometimes even political power. They weren't just passive labourers. Your quirky insight: Peasant communes were real, and some organised local self-rule, complete with town militias and negotiated charters, and the scholarly debate. How much individual freedom did peasants really have, and how did that vary across different regions and centuries? So next time someone calls you a peasant, like it's an insult, just remind them, medieval peasants sued people, ran local governments, and occasionally overthrew tax systems. What have you done today? Let's dim the torchlight and wander into the winding halls of medieval spirituality, where the biggest myth of all still echoes like Gregorian chant through stone cloisters, that everyone in the Middle Ages was a strict, unquestioning Christian, and the whole continent moved in lockstep under one holy worldview. Church on Sunday, no questions asked. All belief, no doubt. Just endless piety, rosaries, and fear of eternal hellfire. But as you're probably expecting by now, that's way too simple. Yes, Christianity was a dominant force, but medieval belief was far more complex, occasionally very weird, and sometimes downright heretical. So here's the setup. The Catholic Church was the spiritual and political heavyweight of the era. From Rome to rural England, its influence was vast. It controlled land, dictated holidays, sent out inquisitors, and kept a watchful eye on kings and peasants alike. Monasteries were everywhere, and people marked their calendars by feast days and saints' anniversaries. But that doesn't mean everyone walked around murmuring Hail Marys with blind devotion. The spiritual landscape was messy, some people were devout, others were sceptical. Many blended official doctrine in with older folk practices, local legends, and whatever their neighbour said probably worked. Let's say you're a farmer in 12th century France, you go to Mass, you know the Lord's Prayer, probably in Latin, though you don't understand a word of it. You celebrate Easter, attend Saint Day processions, and maybe even go on a pilgrimage if you're feeling brave or desperate. But you also keep a horseshoe over your door to ward off evil spirits. You might leave bread out for wandering souls. You avoid certain trees at night, just in case they're haunted. If your cow gets sick, you pray to St. Blaise, but also ask the old woman down the road to burn some herbs and chant something ancient under her breath. And none of this seems contradictory to you. It's just belief. Layered, local, and completely alive. The line between Christian and not Christian enough was often blurry. The church did try to crack down on superstitions, pagan holdovers, and weird local customs, but they didn't have the internet, surveillance drones, or even standardized sermons. They sent out travelling preachers, issued decrees, and occasionally condemned entire regions for being too heretical. But enforcement was patchy. A bishop might preach against fertility rituals one day, then quietly attend the village feast the next, wine in hand, pretending not to notice the phallic-shaped bread being paraded through town. Now let's talk about heresy, because this is where things get spicy. Heresies in the Middle Ages weren't just theological missteps, they were full-on alternative belief systems. The Cathars in southern France, for example, believed the physical world was evil, denied the authority of the Catholic Church, and had their own clergy. They were so committed to their dualistic worldview that they rejected material possessions, meat, sex, and the idea of a vengeful God. The Church didn't just dislike them, it launched a literal crusade against them. The Albigensian Crusade wiped out entire towns, often with the infamous battle cry, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Not exactly your Sunday school lesson. And then there were the Waldensians, who preached poverty, questioned clerical authority, and spread scripture in the local language, centuries before the Protestant Reformation. For this they were excommunicated and persecuted. But here's the twist. These groups weren't fringe because nobody believed them. They were fringe because the church feared how many people did. When heresies caught on, they did so because they spoke to real grievances, corruption in the church, political oppression, or spiritual hunger that wasn't being met by standard sermons. Meanwhile, Jewish communities lived throughout medieval Europe, often in segregated quarters, but still vital to local economies and culture. Contrary to popular belief, Jews weren't just oppressed from day one. There were times of relative peace and even cooperation. Jewish scholars translated texts, served as physicians, and held respected positions. But inevitably, prejudice, scapegoating, and violence followed. Forced conversions, expulsions, and massacres, especially during the Crusades and the Black Death, left deep scars. Still, Judaism persisted, underground or in exile, a quiet thread through the Christian tapestry. And here's a bizarre little footnote. Some medieval Christians believed in green men, forest spirits carved into churches, representing fertility and rebirth. Others swore by dragons, unicorns, and miraculous relics that bled or glowed in the dark. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles to see the finger of a saint, the feather of an angel, or, no kidding, the milk of the Virgin Mary. Holy objects became both sacred and commercial. Relic tourism was booming. You could buy forgiveness in indulgences, earn it on pilgrimage, or just hope that rubbing a bone in a dusty chapel would shave a few centuries off your purgatory sentence. The scholarly debate here is a fascinating one. How much of medieval belief was truly orthodox, and how much was a rich stew of superstition, pagan survival, local folklore, and church doctrine, and all tangled together? Some historians argue that the average medieval person barely understood the tenets of Christian theology. Others point out that literacy and education were spreading fast by the later Middle Ages, and that sermons, art and drama helped regular folks absorb the essentials. Either way, religion wasn't a neat line, it was a chaotic spectrum. And let's not forget mystics. People like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Meister Eckhart had visions, wrote poetry, and preached ideas that sometimes rubbed dangerously close to heresy. But because they were charismatic, educated, or politically well-placed, they got away with it, or at least avoided being lit on fire. Mysticism wasn't fringe. It was often central to medieval spirituality, especially for those seeking a personal connection with the divine. Tonight's historical fact: medieval belief was diverse, layered, and far from uniformly orthodox. Folk religion, heresies, mysticism, and superstition all played major roles. Your fringe detail: some churches housed relics like the Holy Foreskin, which, yes, was exactly what it sounds like, and there were multiple competing ones. And your scholarly debate? Was the average medieval Christian deeply informed in their faith, or just going through the motions with a healthy dose of superstition? So next time someone says everyone back then was just blindly religious, remind them that even in the Middle Ages, belief was messy. Saints glowed, cows got blessed, and someone out there was probably whispering a spell over their garden gnome. Let's crack open a dusty tome and take a look at another enduring myth, that nobody in the Middle Ages could read or write, at all. Not the nobles, not the priests, certainly not the peasants. Just a continent full of people squinting at squiggly lines and wondering what they meant, right? It paints a grim picture, one where literacy died with the Romans and didn't wake up again until Shakespeare waltzed onto the stage in ruffled pants. But as you can probably guess by now, that's wildly oversimplified. Books existed. People read them, some couldn't get enough. First, let's set the scene. It's the 12th century. You're walking through a monastic scriptorium, a long, echoey room that smells like wax, ink, and very old leather. Rows of robed monks sit hunched over desks, copying texts by hand. Not just Bibles either. There are bestiaries, medical treatises, epic poems, histories, cookbooks, and even jokes scrawled in the margins. These aren't mindless drones. They're part of a carefully trained literate workforce. Copying books wasn't just sacred work, it was a form of information preservation, and these guys took it seriously. Monasteries were, without exaggeration, medieval data centres. They housed libraries, real ones, full of scrolls and bound manuscripts. And those libraries weren't locked away in secret towers. Nobles, scholars, and sometimes even merchants had access. Books were expensive, yes, but not mythical. Owning a book was like owning a laptop in the 80s, a symbol of wealth, education, and connection to a bigger world. But here's where it gets juicy. Literacy wasn't just confined to the cloister. In cities across Europe, especially by the High and Late Middle Ages, literacy was spreading like wildfire. Cathedral schools, universities, and private tutors were turning out readers faster than you'd expect. By the 13th century, universities had popped up in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and elsewhere. Places filled with students who not only read but argued, debated, annotated, and wrote. These weren't just theology nerds either. They studied law, medicine, astronomy, arithmetic. You know, the usual bedtime reading. And no, it wasn't just men. Noble women, particularly in the later Middle Ages, were frequently educated. Take Christine de Pizan, who wrote books defending women's intelligence and moral worth back in the 1400s, centuries before your favourite feminist zine. Or Eleanor of Aquitaine, who patronised poets and read Latin. Or even less famous ladies like merchant widows who had to keep accounts, read contracts, and navigate property laws. Literacy wasn't handed out like candy, but it wasn't locked in a tower either. Here's your quirky twist. Literacy wasn't always about full fluency. There was something called partial literacy, where people could recognise key symbols, numbers or phrases. A merchant might not write a novel, but he could read a bill of sale. A peasant might not quote Augustine, but she could recognise a saint's name or a familiar hymn. Signatures weren't always signatures. Some were personalised marks, and churches used visual aids, like stained glass windows and murals, to communicate biblical stories to those who weren't fully literate. It was a multimedia society before multimedia was even a word. The rise of guilds and urban life made reading even more practical. Contracts had to be signed. Laws needed to be understood. Instructions, recipes and prayers were copied and shared. There were even public readings, sort of like medieval TED Talks, but with more incense and Latin. In some towns, a crier would read the news out loud while others followed along on posted broadsheets. Literacy was not all or nothing. It was a continuum, and it was growing. Now, the printing press did change everything, but not because it suddenly taught people how to read. By the time Gutenberg started cranking out Bibles in the mid-15th century, the demand was already there. People wanted books. They just couldn't afford them. Scribes took weeks or months to copy a single volume. Printing made books faster, cheaper, and more accessible, but it didn't invent the appetite for reading. That appetite had been simmering for centuries. Let's not forget, even before Gutenberg there were lending libraries, that's right. In some monasteries and universities, people could check out books, on a chain, yes, but still. Chained libraries kept the books from walking off, not the people from reading them. And these weren't all theological snooze fests. People loved romances, saints' lives, heroic epics, and even travel guides. The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a wildly fictional account of journeys through exotic lands, was a medieval bestseller. He described dog-headed people and lands where it rained frogs. Absolute nonsense, but hey, who doesn't love a good story? Here's the scholarly debate. Just how many people could read in the Middle Ages? Estimates vary wildly. Some argue that only 5 to 10% of the population was literate before the printing press, while others suggest higher numbers in towns and among certain professions. The truth likely lies in the middle. Literacy rates depended heavily on geography, class, gender and occupation. A rural peasant? Maybe not. A city merchant? Quite possibly. A monk or nun? Definitely. A 15-year-old university student in Bologna with ink-stained fingers and way too many scrolls? Absolutely. And here's your fringe fact. There are surviving manuscripts where monks scribbled complaints in the margins like modern office workers stuck on a deadline. Things like, "Oh my hand," or "This parchment is hairy," or even "New parchment, bad ink, I say nothing more." One wrote, thank God, it will soon be dark." That's the medieval equivalent of rage-quitting a Google Doc. So no, the Middle Ages weren't a dark vacuum of illiteracy. They were a time when reading mattered a lot. Whether it was the chants of monks, the notes of scribes, or the prayers of merchants, literacy was a living, evolving force. Books were symbols of power, tools of learning, and sometimes just good entertainment. Tonight's historical fact: literacy in the Middle Ages was more widespread than people think, especially among clergy, nobility, and the growing urban middle class. Your quirky insight. Monks sometimes wrote hilarious complaints in manuscript margins, tiny in passive-aggressive notes from the past. And your scholarly debate? Were pre-printing press literacy rates closer to 5%, 20%, or even higher in urban centres? So next time someone says nobody could read back then, remind them that even medieval scribes were too tired to finish their work, and they still found time to complain about it in writing. Tonight let's pack a satchel and lace up some worn leather boots, because we're tackling another tired old myth that people in the Middle Ages never travelled. Supposedly everyone just stayed glued to their birth village, never strayed more than 5 miles from home, and stared suspiciously at anything beyond the hedgerow. The idea is that medieval folks were static, isolated, and terrified of the unknown, too poor, too ignorant, or too superstitious to wander. But that's just not true. In fact, the medieval world was full of movement. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, scholars, even tourists. Yep, actual medieval tourism. You might not be able to book a flight or complain about airport Wi-Fi, but medieval people were out and about more than you'd expect. Let's start with the obvious one: pilgrimages. These weren't just religious obligations, they were also one of the most common forms of travel. From the 11th century onward, Christian Europe saw millions of people travelling to holy sites. From local shrines to faraway destinations like Santiago de Compostela, in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome itself. Some even made the long and dangerous trek to Jerusalem. Pilgrims walked, rode horses, or hitched rides on carts. They banded together in groups for safety, camped in roadside hostels and exchanged stories, and probably fleas, along the way. They wore badges to show where they'd been, like medieval versions of those "I climbed Mount Whatever" t-shirts, and yes, they often brought souvenirs. Now, not all pilgrims were saints in waiting. Some used the trip as penance for crimes, others used it as an excuse to escape debts or bad marriages, and some were straight-up thrill-seekers, people who wanted an adventure, a change of scenery, or the chance to drink in another town. The lines between religion, tourism, and low-level mischief were blurry at best. And it wasn't just the devout making the rounds. Merchants travelled constantly. Trade routes crisscrossed Europe, from the fairs of Champagne to the ports of Genoa and Bruges, and you had cloth coming from England, spices from the east, silk from Byzantium, glass from Venice. Travelling merchants were the arteries of the medieval economy, carrying goods, gossip, and disease in equal measure. They didn't just sell wares, they introduced new ideas, technologies, and styles wherever they went. Ever wonder how spices from India ended up on a table in London? It wasn't teleportation. It was relentless, muddy, boot-wearing trade. And then you've got the students. Yes, medieval students. Picture a teenager in 13th century Paris with an armful of parchment and the early version of a dorm room beard, making his way to the University of Bologna. Medieval universities weren't local affairs. They were international hubs. If you were smart and, male and well-connected, you could study abroad centuries before it was cool. Students and scholars moved between cities to chase lectures by famous masters. Think of it as medieval academic clout chasing. And yes, they got rowdy, got fined, got into tavern brawls, and sometimes rioted over bad housing. So nothing's changed. Let's not forget soldiers. Whether they were professional knights, mercenaries, or unlucky conscripts, military service took people far from home. Crusaders marched thousands of miles to the Middle East. Others were dragged into conflicts between kingdoms or local nobles, and while war was obviously brutal, it was also one of the most common ways medieval people saw new places. They just had to do it while dodging arrows. And here's the quirky detail for tonight. There were actual medieval guidebooks. One of the most famous was the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, a wild mix of fantasy and geography that claimed to describe far-off lands and bizarre peoples, like dog-headed men or trees that grew sheep. Obviously it was nonsense, but it was popular because people wanted to know about the world beyond their walls, even if those stories were creatively exaggerated. Women travelled too, especially nuns, noblewomen, merchants' wives and pilgrims. Abbesses visited other abbeys. Noble women moved for marriage or diplomacy, and merchant women. They sometimes handled shipping routes and long-distance business deals themselves. It wasn't exactly a Ural pass, but they got around. Now, some people really did stay local their whole lives. If you were a smallholder farmer without means or incentive, your village might be your world. But even then, you probably went to market towns, saw travelling entertainers, or dealt with tax collectors from miles away. Medieval villages weren't locked rooms, they were part of regional networks. Fairs, feasts and courts brought outsiders in, and occasionally you went out. So where does the myth come from? Mostly from 19th century historians projecting industrial age assumptions backward. They saw trains and cars as symbols of progress, so they painted earlier times as immobile and primitive. But movement isn't just about machines, it's about roads, desire, and opportunity. And medieval people had all three. Sure, the roads were rough and there weren't clean bathrooms along the way, but you could get from London to Rome with enough coin and a strong stomach. Here's the scholarly debate. How mobile was the average person? Some argue that most people travelled only within a day's walk of home. Others point to evidence of long-distance movement, especially among the working classes after the Black Death, when labour shortages gave people the leverage to leave their lords and seek better pay elsewhere. Wages in one town not cutting it? Pack up and try the next. Feudal obligations were still a thing, but they didn't always stick. And now for a fun historical side note, there were professional pilgrims, people who made pilgrimages on behalf of others who couldn't go. Basically, you'd pay someone to walk to a holy site, pray for your soul, and bring back a badge. Imagine hiring someone to do your spiritual steps for you, medieval Uber Eats, but for piety. Tonight's hard fact: people in the Middle Ages did travel across towns, regions, countries, and continents for religion, trade, study, war, and more. Your quirky gem: there were medieval guidebooks full of fantastical descriptions of foreign lands, and people loved them. And your scholarly debate: how far did the average person really travel in their lifetime, and what factors influenced their mobility the most? So next time someone says, medieval folks never left the village, tell them about the scholar on his way to Paris, the merchant docking in Tunis, or the nun who walked 500 miles, and maybe, just maybe, the peasant who decided to see what was beyond the next hill. Let's put on a pestle-smeared apron and open the medieval medicine cabinet. Brace yourself, it smells like garlic, mint, and questionable optimism. Tonight's myth: that medieval medicine was pure superstition, leeches, and prayers to saints. Nothing but a long, fevered waiting game until death politely took you off the patient list. You've heard it before: no real doctors, no understanding of disease, and definitely no hope if you sneeze too loud. But that bleak picture leaves out a huge amount of actual knowledge, practice, and believe it or not, some treatments that actually worked. Medieval medicine was far from perfect, but it wasn't just throwing herbs at the moon either. First, let's talk structure. Medicine in the Middle Ages was built around the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that your health depended on keeping these humours balanced. Too much black bile, melancholy; too much yellow bile, angry and rash; phlegm heavy, you might be sluggish or snotty. Today that might sound like astrology for body fluids, but back then it provided a consistent framework for diagnosis and treatment. And for the record, some of those treatments, diet changes, herbal remedies, bleeding in certain contexts, did something even if they didn't quite match our modern scientific standards. Now, yes, leeches were used, but not everywhere and not all the time. Bleeding was a treatment option, not a one-size-fits-all solution. Doctors and barber surgeons, yes, barbers did surgery, more on that chaos in a second, had whole manuals outlining when, how, and where to bleed someone. It wasn't random bloodletting in a back alley. It was based on season, age, symptoms, even the alignment of the stars. That's right, astrology was a huge part of medieval medicine. Your chart might determine whether today's the best day to lance that boil or not. Silly? Maybe. But systematic? Absolutely. And speaking of surgery, let's talk about the medieval scalpel. It existed. So did bone saws, cautery irons, and trepanation drills for brain injuries. Medieval surgeons could remove bladder stones, treat cataracts, stitch wounds, and even perform amputations with surprising success. Anesthesia? Well, there were sleeping potions made from hemlock, mandrake, or opium derivatives. Risky, yes, but not entirely ineffective. And while surgical hygiene wasn't up to 21st century standards, no gloves, no Purell, some texts do recommend washing wounds with wine or vinegar to prevent infection. Not bad for an era supposedly devoid of medical sense. Now, where did they learn this stuff? From books, lots of books. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe was heavily influenced by earlier Greek, Roman, and Islamic texts. Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna were standard reading. The Canon of Medicine by Avicenna was a medical textbook for centuries. Translated into Latin, it spread through universities across Europe. Yes, universities. Medicine was an actual degree. You could become a licensed physician in Paris, Bologna, or Salerno, complete with gowns, titles, and long Latin-filled lectures. And here's the quirky fact of the night. The barber surgeon wasn't just a guy with scissors. He pulled teeth, set bones, lanced abscesses, and even performed battlefield surgeries. The classic barber pole, white and red stripes, comes from the blood-stained rags they'd hang outside to dry. So next time you're getting a trim, just remember, a few hundred years ago, that chair could have also been your amputation station. But it wasn't all men in academic robes. Women were also healers, midwives, herbalists, and apothecaries. They passed knowledge down through generations, grew medicinal herbs, and often had a better bedside manners than their male counterparts. Some noble women ran their own informal clinics on estates. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote medical treatises alongside her mystical visions and musical compositions. Of course, women healers sometimes found themselves accused of witchcraft if things went wrong, but that had more to do with politics and power than actual beliefs about health. Now, here's the scholarly debate. How effective was medieval medicine? Some argue that it was more symbolic and comforting than curative, that treatments were rituals designed to give patients hope, not results. Others point out that many herbal remedies had real pharmacological effects. Garlic for infections, willow bark for pain, hello, natural aspirin, honey as an antiseptic. It's not all snake oil. Even the dreaded plague doctor outfit with its beaked masks stuffed with herbs wasn't entirely nonsense. The herbs didn't stop the disease, but they masked the smell and maybe even filtered a few pathogens through sheer luck. Hospitals existed too. Not quite the sterile, fluorescent lit variety we know today, but institutions where people were cared for, fed, washed, and sometimes even healed. Many were run by religious orders. Monks and nuns provided round-the-clock care, especially for the poor and travellers. Charity was central to the mission, but so was actual nursing. They recorded symptoms, kept patients warm, offered treatments, and kept things cleaner than many later hospitals would. Medieval medicine also adapted. During the Black Death, some doctors started isolating patients, avoiding crowded areas, and wearing protective gear. The results were mixed, because, plague, but the instinct to prevent spread was there. Quarantine, in fact, was a medieval invention, starting in port cities like Venice, where ships had to wait 40 days, a quaranta, before unloading. It wasn't perfect science, but it showed that observation, trial, and even public health policies existed long before Pasteur and penicillin. Of course, there were also the weird remedies. Eat a ruby, bury a toad, wrap yourself in a dead cat. The line between useful and please don't do that was sometimes thin, but then again if you lived in an age where disease struck without warning and medical knowledge was still in its adolescence, wouldn't you try anything? Tonight's hard fact: medieval medicine was based on a structured system of theory and practice that included hospitals, surgeries and pharmacology, not just superstition. Your quirky takeaway: the red and white barber pole traces back to blood-soaked bandages hung out to dry by multitasking barbers, and the scholarly debate: were medieval treatments more symbolic than effective, or do surviving records show real functional medical understanding? So the next time someone mocks medieval people for using leeches, just remind them, those guys were performing cataract surgery while we were still figuring out how to stop clicking accept all cookies. Tonight, let's walk up a winding stone path toward one of the most misunderstood structures of the Middle Ages, the castle. You've seen them in every movie set before 1600, cold grey, echoing husks filled with the drafty corridors, rats, and moody nobles wrapped in furs. They're always dark, always depressing, and always seem to smell like wet dog and regret. The popular idea is that castles were basically glorified dungeons, just slightly more vertical, where everyone froze, suffered and brooded. But surprise, castles were not medieval punishment boxes. In fact, many of them were lively, colourful, and even comfortable homes, by medieval standards anyway. Let's step inside one. You're entering a noble's castle in 14th century France. The outer walls might be intimidating, sure. They're built for defence, not curb appeal. But the interior tells a different story. Tapestries line the walls, not just for decoration, but for insulation. Floors are covered in rushes, sometimes scented with herbs. Large windows, glass, if you're lucky and loaded, let in natural light. The hearth is roaring. Cushioned benches line the great hall. The walls are painted, yes, painted, with murals or bold geometric patterns. This place isn't a stone prison. It's designed to impress guests, keep out enemies, and most importantly, keep the family warm and dry. And the colours, vibrant. Medieval people loved colour. They painted the ceilings, added bright coats of arms, and used richly dyed textiles everywhere. Castles weren't grey inside, they were practically kaleidoscopic. If you think they were all dull and miserable, blame centuries of erosion and restoration stripping them down to bare stone. That moody Gothic look is more of a modern aesthetic than a historical truth. Of course, castles were fortified for a reason. They were military structures as much as homes. Thick walls, moats, arrow slits, portcullises. These were meant to repel sieges, not host dinner parties. But when not under threat, life inside a castle was surprisingly full. Nobles hosted feasts. Musicians performed, children played with toys, yes, actual toys, and guests arrived regularly. If you were a servant or cook, sure, your quarters were more modest, but even then, castles were usually better than peasant cottages. They had food, structure, and a tight-knit community, and bathhouses. Yes, bathhouses. Here's the quirky bit. Some castles had actual plumbings, not like your modern pipes and sinks setup, but there were garderobes, toilets, built into the walls with vertical shafts so people carried waste down into cesspits or moats. Some castles even had rudimentary flushing systems using rainwater. Hot water? In some cases, yes. Heated in a cauldron and poured into bathtubs made of wood or stone. Luxury? Not quite. But you wouldn't be sitting in a corner of the Great Hall, freezing your chainmail off. Let's not forget about food. Castle kitchens were vast operations. There were whole teams dedicated to baking, brewing, roasting, spicing and serving. Meals for the Lord's table were elaborate, especially during holidays or important visits. You would get roasts, pies, stews, candied fruit, mulled wine, and exotic spices, sometimes even entertainment mid-course. Picture a peacock served with its feathers reattached, or a pie that releases live birds when sliced. Medieval castles weren't just about defence, they were about display. Now, that said, not all castles were comfy palaces. Some were hastily built strongholds on the border of enemy territory. Wooden motte and Bailey designs were quick to throw up and not especially cosy. And if your lord was more into warfare than hospitality, your castle might feel like boot camp. But many of the great stone castles of Europe evolved over time into refined residences. They added solas, private rooms with fireplaces for the lord and lady. They had private chapels, libraries, and even enclosed gardens. Life in a castle wasn't always luxurious, but it wasn't the eternal misery pit we're often shown either. And let's be honest, no matter how warm the hearth, it could get cold. Castles were still made of stone and insulation only went so far, winters were tough. But that's why everyone wore layers, huddled together, and used those tapestries for more than just decoration. You might not have a thermostat, but you'd make it work, with wool, furs, and strategic proximity to the fireplace. Now here's the scholarly debate. Were castles primarily homes or military fortresses? The answer varies. In early medieval times, especially post-Norman conquest, castles were aggressively functional, meant to hold land and keep peasants in line. But over the centuries, as stability increased and nobles shifted towards status display, castles became more about prestige than protection. By the late Middle Ages, some castles were so elaborate and well-appointed that they started blending into what we'd now call palaces. And then there's the social side. Castles weren't just homes, they were power centres. Justice was administered here. Taxes were collected, contracts were signed, marriages were arranged, gossip was currency. The Great Hall wasn't just a dining space, it was a political stage. If you were invited to dine at a noble's castle, you weren't just being fed, you were being evaluated, tested, manoeuvred. Medieval social networking with meat pies and minstrels, your fringe detail of the night. Some castles had designated listening holes, tiny architectural features built into walls so that servants or spies could discreetly overhear conversations. Surveillance isn't new, folks. It just used to come with cloaks and candles. Tonight's hard historical fact: castles were homes as well as fortresses, often comfortable, colourful and socially vibrant, not just cold stone prisons. Your quirky bonus: barber surgeons weren't the only multitaskers. Some castle walls had built-in listening holes for a bit of medieval eavesdropping. And the scholarly debate? How much did castles shift from military strongholds to domestic status symbols over the course of the Middle Ages? So next time someone says, "I bet castles were miserable to live in," ask them if they've ever tried soaking in a wooden bathtub next to a roaring fire under painted ceilings while eating a gilded swan. Not so miserable now, huh? Let's pull up a tapestry-draped chair and get real about the role of women in the Middle Ages, because the myth floating around is loud and lazy, that women had zero power. None. That they were basically mobile dowries, forever barefoot, pregnant, and silenced by cloister walls or kitchen doors. It's a bleak image. Half the population pushed into the margins of history, uneducated, uninfluential, and unimportant. But like most sweeping generalizations about the past, this one crumbles under even a little scrutiny. The truth? Women in the Middle Ages were more involved, more powerful and more present than people give them credit for. Were things equal? Of course not. This was still a patriarchal world. Women were often excluded from formal education, political power and inheritance, but often isn't the same as always. Women worked, wrote, ruled, fought, traded and built. Some were even saints and queens at the same time, and others just quietly running entire communities while the men were off doing dramatic things in armour. Let's start with noble women. The stereotype here is the passive lady in the tower, embroidering roses and waiting to be married off like a piece of human real estate. And yes, marriages were often arranged for political or financial reasons, But once that ring was on, many women ruled their households, and occasionally the realm. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen of France, Queen of England, mother of kings and probably more politically competent than most of the men she was surrounded by. Or Matilda of Tuscany, who commanded armies. Or Margaret of Denmark, who ruled over not one but 3 kingdoms during the Kalmar Union. Not exactly sitting around waiting to be rescued. And don't sleep on the power of the household. Managing a medieval estate wasn't just fluff work. It involved overseeing budgets, food production, staff, children, and diplomacy. Noble women were often left in charge when their husbands went off to war or crusade, and in their absence these women could act as regents, administer justice, and make decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Imagine being 25 years old and suddenly responsible for an entire estate's finances, security and seasonal harvest. This wasn't stay in the kitchen energy, it was executive-level multitasking. But what about women lower down the social ladder? Peasant women worked. Period. They helped in the fields, ran market stalls, brewed ale, raised animals and made textiles. And let's not pretend these were supporting roles. The medieval economy needed their labour. Some women even ran their own small businesses. Bakers, innkeepers, midwives, weavers. Town records from places like York or Bruges show women signing contracts of peace, appearing in court, collecting rent, and sometimes even suing their husbands. Yes, suing their husbands. Legal agency wasn't just a noblewoman's luxury. And speaking of courtrooms, women also had access to the justice system, at least in certain contexts. They could be plaintiffs or defendants in civil suits. In parts of medieval England and France, women could inherit property, especially if there were no brothers. Widows in particular wielded a surprising amount of freedom. Once their husbands were gone, many widows controlled their own finances, made their own contracts, and, in some cases, chose whether to remarry. Others didn't. They'd already done their time and weren't about to dive back in. Now here's a quirky bit of history you probably didn't learn in school. In some medieval towns, there were all-female guilds. These were formal associations of tradeswomen, often in textiles, brewing or midwifery, that regulated quality, prices and apprenticeships just like the boys' clubs did. Some even had their own patron saints and parades. A woman who ran her own shop or workshop wasn't seen as shocking. It was just another part of the urban workforce. And in the church? Oh, don't even get started. Yes, the official hierarchy was male-dominated, but women still held powerful roles within religious life. Abbesses could oversee large monastic communities and wield authority over both nuns and monks. Some wrote treatises, ran schools, or corresponded with popes. Hildegard of Bingen, not to name-drop her again, but come on, was a theologian, composer, physician, visionary, and all-around medieval celebrity. If she'd had a TikTok, she would have broken the internet with herbal hot takes and divine visions. Women were also artists, writers, and poets. Christine de Pizan wrote the Book of the City of Ladies in the early 15th century, a bold, eloquent defence of women's intelligence and virtue, complete with historical examples and a mic-drop ending. She was a professional writer, like gold. She paid her bills with her pen and was respected in her time. Her work wasn't a secret diary tucked under a mattress. It was published, read, and debated. Of course, it wasn't all empowerment and sunshine. There were real limits. Misogyny was alive and well. The legal system was inconsistent. Education for women was often tied to class, and punishments for stepping out of line could be brutal. Accusations of witchcraft, for example, hit women hardest, especially in the later medieval and early modern periods. Women's sexuality was policed, their bodies scrutinised, and their behaviour judged by double standards. Sound familiar? So here's the scholarly debate. Were medieval women unusually oppressed compared to other eras? Or did they actually enjoy more social power than their Renaissance, or even early modern counterparts? Some historians argue that the Middle Ages offered unique opportunities for female authority, especially in religious or feudal contexts. Others suggest those examples are exceptional, and that most women still faced rigid gender norms and systemic barriers. The truth likely lives somewhere in the grey area. The Middle Ages were neither a feminist utopia nor an unbroken chain of subjugation. Your fun fringe fact? Some women disguised themselves as men to join military orders, become scribes, or travel safely. A few were even discovered only after death, when their bones were examined and, surprise, that knight, that monk, not a dude, just someone determined enough to bend the rules for a shot at freedom. Tonight's historical fact: medieval women had far more roles and agency than the popular powerless damsel stereotype suggests. They worked, ruled, created, and often shaped the very communities they lived in. Your quirky bit: all female guilds existed in certain towns, where women controlled trade, trained apprentices, and held serious local clout. And the scholarly debate: were medieval women relatively empowered within their social systems, or are the strong examples outliers in a sea of silence? So next time someone says women in the Middle Ages had no power, you can raise an eyebrow and ask, which women? Because some of them were running kingdoms, publishing books and suing neighbours, all before coffee was even a thing. Let's bite into one of the juiciest but totally misplaced myths about the medieval world: that people in the Middle Ages were terrified of tomatoes, that they thought they were poison, that they shrieked and ran from the sight of a salad. It's a fun little story. Imagine a noble recoiling from a tomato like it's a venomous toad. But, sorry to disappoint, it doesn't hold up. And here's the kicker: this myth doesn't even belong to the Middle Ages. It's Renaissance-era drama, and even then, mostly an exaggerated footnote in culinary history. Medieval folks didn't fear tomatoes. They just didn't know they existed. Let's back up and look at the timeline. Tomatoes are native to the Americas, that big landmass on the other side of the Atlantic that Europe didn't discover until the late 15th century, after the Middle Ages were already giving their final bow. Columbus made landfall in 1492. The tomato? It didn't start appearing in European botanical records until the mid-1500s, so medieval people weren't afraid of tomatoes. They had no clue what a tomato was. If you'd shown one to a medieval farmer in 1200, they might have admired it, sniffed it, poked it with a stick, and then gone right back to tending their cabbages, completely unbothered. So where did the tomato panic idea come from? That's a Renaissance and early modern issue, mostly in Northern Europe. When tomatoes did show up, people weren't sure how to categorise them. Were they edible, decorative, medicinal, dangerous? They were part of the nightshade family, which includes some truly toxic plants like belladonna and mandrake, so suspicion wasn't entirely unfounded. But poison? That was mostly a result of poor tableware choices. Here's the weird twist. Wealthy Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries often ate off pewter plates, which are made from tin and sometimes contained lead. Tomatoes are acidic. When acidic food touches lead-containing metal, it can leach toxins into the dish. People started getting sick. Naturally, they blamed the tomato, not the plate. So the nobleman wasn't poisoned by the tomato, he was poisoned by his own fancy table setting. Classic. But again, none of this is medieval. It's part of the culinary growing pains that came after the Middle Ages, when Europe was still trying to figure out what the New World had handed them. Tomatoes, potatoes, chili peppers, corn, cacao, vanilla. All these revolutionary ingredients were completely unknown to medieval Europe. Their food was based on what was locally grown or imported via trade with the East and North Africa. No marinara, no fries, no chocolate truffles. And yet, as we discussed earlier, it was anything but bland. Now, while tomatoes were MIA, medieval Europe had its own extensive plant lore. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks, lentils, peas, beans, apples, pears, cherries and plums were standard fare. Herbs like sage, thyme, rosemary and parsley grew in gardens, and were used in both cooking and medicine. Spices like pepper, cinnamon and saffron, imported at great expense, were culinary gold. And even without tomatoes, medieval cooks knew how to make rich sauces, savoury potages, and fruit-based condiments that gave food real depth. So yes, they were doing just fine. Here's a quirky fact for the night. The first recorded European recipe for tomatoes appears in a 1692 Neapolitan cookbook, and even that was copied from a Spanish source. It was a stew-like dish with eggplant and onions. There's no mention of fear or poison, just a practical way to turn this weird red fruit into something delicious. By the 18th century, tomatoes were well on their way to becoming the cornerstone of southern European cuisine. The scholarly debate here is fun. How quickly did New World foods enter the European diet, and why were some adopted faster than others? Potatoes took a long time to catch on in some places, France in particular. Meanwhile, tomatoes spread more rapidly in Spain and Italy, likely because of climate, availability, and local culinary traditions. Some historians suggest cultural conservatism slowed the adoption of new foods. Others point out that people were eager to try novel ingredients. especially if they were easy to grow and added variety to existing diets. Meanwhile, other food myths have been slapped onto the Middle Ages, without context. No forks, not true. While forks weren't common early on, by the High Middle Ages, the upper classes were using them, especially in Italy. Belief in poisonous potatoes, again, a later issue. And that thing about people thinking tomatoes were aphrodisiacs? There's some truth there. But again, that's post-medieval sauciness. What's really going on here is that we tend to lump everything pre-industrial into one foggy ancient past and paint it with the same brush. So if tomatoes were feared in 1600, as surely the medieval folks in 1200 must have feared them too, right? Nope, tomatoes were still chilling in the Andes, minding their own business, waiting to become pizza sauce. Tonight's hard fact: tomatoes didn't exist in Europe during the Middle Ages and weren't feared until centuries later, thanks largely to bad science and worse tableware. Your quirky detail: early tomato skeptics weren't wrong because of superstition. They were accidentally poisoning themselves with lead-infused pewter plates. And the scholarly debate: what factors shaped the seed and spread of New World crops across post-medieval Europe, and why did some ingredients take centuries to become mainstream? So the next time someone claims medieval people thought tomatoes were poison, you can smile politely and say, "They didn't even know tomatoes existed, my dude." Then maybe hand them a fork just to complete the historical redemption arc. Alright, it's time to tackle one of the most stubborn, dramatic, and totally fabricated images in pop medieval history: the horned Viking helmet. You know the one. A muscled Norseman standing on the prow of a longship, wind in his beard, axe in hand, and a glorious set of horns sprouting from his helmet like an angry bull's crown. The problem? That helmet and the horns are completely fictional. Not, oh, it's exaggerated fictional. Fully made up. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets into battle, and the fact that we still picture them that way is a perfect case of history getting dressed up for the stage and refusing to take off the costume. So let's get this out of the way. No archaeological evidence has ever confirmed that Viking warriors wore horned helmets. Helmets did exist, simple iron ones, often rounded, sometimes with a nose guard, but they were practical. You don't strap a pair of antelope horns to your skull and then go swinging a sword in close combat, unless your goal is to die impressively. Real Viking helmets were made for function, not flair. So where did this idea come from? The short answer, the 19th century. More specifically, opera. In 1876, Richard Wagner debuted his legendary cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, and the costume designers needed something suitably epic for the Norse gods and heroes. Horned helmets fit the bill. They weren't aiming for accuracy, they were aiming for vibe. The horned helmet was born not on the battlefield, but on the stage under gaslight, accompanied by a 90-piece orchestra. The image stuck because it was dramatic, iconic, and very, very photogenic. From there, the horns made their way into illustrations, museum displays, and eventually mass media. By the time movies and comic books got a hold of them, Viking warriors were forever branded as the angry guys with bull horns. It's such a powerful image that even people who know it's wrong still cling to it because, let's face it, it looks cool. But the Vikings would have rolled their eyes. Assuming they had time between pillaging, farming, and making extremely well-crafted combs, yes, we'll get to that. Now, the reality of Viking warfare was gritty, practical, and a lot less theatrical. Many warriors didn't even wear helmets. They were expensive and not widely available. The average Viking might have relied on a simple leather cap or no headgear at all, with a round wooden shield as his primary defence. Axes, spears, and short swords were the weapons of choice. Chainmail, if you could afford it. Otherwise you might be fighting in wool and hope. The image of elite warriors covered in ornate gear is mostly reserved for chieftains or those lucky enough to loot some armour off a corpse. But here's where it gets quirky. The idea of warriors wearing horns does have ancient roots, just not Viking ones. In Bronze Age Europe, long before the Viking Age, some ceremonial helmets did have horns. Think Celtic warriors, Etruscan elites, and certain Germanic tribes. These were not combat helmets though, they were used for rituals, parades, or religious purposes, so the concept existed, but it got wrongly applied to the wrong people centuries later, a classic case of historical mix and match. Now let's dip into the wider Viking mythos. While horned helmets are out, style was still very much in. Vikings cared about appearance, cleanliness, grooming, decoration. They wore colourful clothes, used brooches, arm rings, and beads, and often had intricately braided hair. Archaeological digs have uncovered tweezers, combs, nail cleaners, and even ear picks in Viking graves. You might have expected a battle axe, but a personal hygiene kit, that's real. Vikings wanted to look good, smell decent, and impress at the next feast or trade meeting. These were not filthy, mindless savages. They were complex, cultured, and very image-conscious. Here's the scholarly debate. Why did the horned helmet myth survive for so long, even after being debunked? Some argue that it filled a narrative need, something to symbolize the wild, untamed energy people associated with Vikings. Others say it's just good branding. Once you've got that horned helmet on a cereal box, it's hard to walk it back. And museums didn't help. For years, displays included inaccurate reconstructions, reinforcing the fiction. The truth is, we like our history epic, and horns are just more fun than nose guards. Now here's your fringe fact for the night. In 1943, Nazi Germany built a massive Viking-themed propaganda exhibit featuring, you guessed it, horned helmets. The regime wanted to link itself to a powerful warrior heritage, and the horned helmet image was too good to pass up. So even fake history can be weaponized, which makes it more important than ever to separate fact from fantasy. Also worth noting, horned helmets aren't just an issue in Viking mythology. Plenty of cultures have been misrepresented through dramatic, stylized armor and dress. History loves to lean into stereotypes because they're visual shorthand, but if you really want to understand the people of the past, you have to look past the costume drama and into the dirt, the tools, the bones, and yes, the surprisingly intricate combs. So what would a Viking warrior actually look like? Imagine a lean, muscular guy with a sturdy wool tunic, a belt full of tools, a well-maintained axe, and maybe a carved wooden amulet around his neck. His shield bears his family's symbol. His beard is clean, oiled, and likely braided. His helmet, if he has one at all, it's plain, rounded, iron, and very much hornless. Tonight's hard historical fact: Vikings did not wear horned helmets into battle. This image was a 19th century invention, popularised by opera and art, not archaeology. Your quirky takeaway? Vikings were fastidious about grooming. Grave goods include tweezers, combs, and ear picks. You could have borrowed conditioner from a Viking. And the scholarly debate? Why has the horned helmet myth endured so powerfully in the cultural imagination despite zero historical evidence? So next time someone sketches a Viking with horns, just smile and say, "Nice Wagner cosplay, but the real guys, they preferred clean hair and functional headgear." Tonight we're sinking into the murky bubonic myth swamp of all medieval myths, that the Black Death was just one single sudden catastrophe that showed up, killed off half of Europe in a matter of months, and then disappeared like a bad Tinder date, one and done, boom, curtain. But here's the truth, less dramatic maybe, but far more fascinating. The plague wasn't one apocalyptic event. It came in waves, lingered for centuries, and reshaped medieval society in ways that still echo today. It didn't just break the world once, it kept coming back to check on the wreckage. Let's start with the first, most infamous outbreak, 1347 to 1351. That's the one most people know it about. A few Genoese ships roll into a Sicilian port carrying not just grain and sailors, but fleas, rats, and a microscopic party crasher, Yersinia pestis. From there it spreads like wildfire across Europe, killing an estimated 30% to 60% of the population, depending on the region. It's hard to overstate the horror. Entire villages wiped out, cities buried in silence, priests dropping mid-prayer. You've probably heard stories of carts trundling through town with someone shouting, "Bring out your dead!" Wasn't an exaggeration, it was Tuesday Day. But here's the thing most people don't realise. The 1347 to 1351 outbreak wasn't the end. It was just the start. The Black Death returned again and again and again. Roughly every 10 to 20 years, another wave would sweep through, sometimes smaller, sometimes just as bad. In England alone, there were major outbreaks in 1361, 1369, 1374, and so on, well into the 15th century. These weren't aftershocks. These were recurring crises. The term Black Death only refers to the first wave. The broader period of recurring plague epidemics is more accurately called the Second Pandemic, and it lasted over 300 years, and the effect? Monumental. Yes, the initial outbreak was devastating, but the long-term effects were even more transformative. Think labour shortages, economic upheaval, religious doubt, and total social reorganisation. If you're a peasant in 1352 and you've survived the first wave, you suddenly find yourself in high demand. Fields need tending, animals need care, and half the workforce is gone. Suddenly lords are competing for your labour, wages rise, serfs leave manors, entire villages negotiate better conditions, or just abandon feudal life altogether. It's the dawn of worker leverage. Hello, late medieval peasant power. Of course the ruling class hated it. Laws were passed trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, 1351, tried to cap what workers could earn and make it illegal to refuse work. Spoiler, it didn't work. When labour is scarce and survival is on the line, people don't exactly care about your economic policies, and that tension between the empowered survivors and the desperate elites bubbled into revolts, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which we already met a few sections back. Plague didn't just kill, it rearranged society. But it didn't stop there. The psychological impact of repeated plague waves left a deep scar. Art, literature, and religion shifted. Skeletons started dancing across murals in dance macabre scenes. Writers obsessed over death and decay. Pilgrimages surged as people searched for answers or forgiveness. And the church? It took a hit. Many clergy died in the first wave. Replacement priests were sometimes young, poorly trained or seen as opportunists. Faith wobbled. When the church couldn't stop the disease, or even explain it, people began to look elsewhere for meaning. Cue the rise of mysticism, fringe cults, and apocalyptic movements. Groups like the Flagellants marched through Europe whipping themselves in public displays of penance, believing that suffering could end the plague. They were both dramatic and deeply unsettling, and the church, wary of losing control, eventually cracked down on them. But the fear was real. When you've seen your neighbour swell up and die in 2 days flat, you'll try anything. Here's a strange little fringe detail. During some outbreaks, people blamed cats and dogs for the spread of plague and started killing them en masse. Ironically, this probably made things worse, because as we now know, cats kill rats, and rats carried the fleas that carried the disease. So in trying to solve the problem, people may have deleted one of the few natural defences they had. Just a little extra bonus from history's worst group project. And here's your scholarly debate for the night. What exactly caused the waves of plague to keep coming? The dominant theory is that the bacterium persisted in rodent populations, especially in Central Asia, and occasionally jumped back into humans via fleas. Climate shifts, trade routes, and population density all played roles. But new research suggests there may have been multiple strains in play, possibly spreading in different ways, through the air in some cases, not just via fleas. Others argue that poor record-keeping and overlapping epidemics like smallpox or typhus have muddied the historical picture. There is still mystery in the medieval autopsy room. Let's not forget the global scale. While Europe gets most of the plague press, the Black Death didn't stop at the Alps. It swept across the Islamic world, decimated populations in North Africa and the Middle East, and likely reached as far as China. Trade carried it, armies carried it, pilgrims carried it out. This wasn't a local problem. It was the first truly global pandemic, and the world was connected enough to share in the suffering. And through it all, life kept going. People married, worked, made art, told stories. The plague was a backdrop to life, not a freeze frame. If anything, it made life more urgent. The late medieval world had a kind of frantic creativity to it, like a civilization that knew it might not get a second draft. Tonight's hard historical fact: the Black Death wasn't a one-time event. It came in recurring ways for centuries, reshaping European society with each pass. Your quirky fringe detail? In some cities, mass cat killings worsened the plague's spread by letting rat populations boom unchecked. Medieval irony at its bleakest. And the scholarly debate. What exact mechanism sustained recurring plague waves, fleas on rats, airborne transmission, or something we still don't fully understand? So next time someone says the Black Death killed half of Europe and then vanished, just nod slowly and say, yeah, except it didn't. It stuck around, made itself at home, and casually broke history more than once. Tonight we're headed into some seriously weird territory, because we're going to talk about animals on trial. Yes, actual animals. In medieval Europe, not only did humans get hauled into court, but pigs, rats, goats, and even insects could be accused, tried, and sometimes executed for crimes. It sounds like the premise of a Monty Python sketch or a fever dream from someone who's been reading too many law books in candlelight. But it happened. And not just once, multiple times. So the myth that medieval people thought animals had legal responsibilities? Shockingly, it's true. But, as always, the deeper you dig, the more complicated and strangely human it all becomes. Let's start with the basics. There were two main kinds of animal trials: secular and ecclesiastical. Secular courts dealt with domestic animals, usually pigs, and usually for murder. Yes, murder. If a pig attacked a child, which did happen, feral or improperly restrained pigs were known to be dangerous, the local authorities might arrest the pig, assign it a defence attorney, hold a formal trial, and if found guilty, execute it publicly. With all the trappings of human justice, because apparently nothing says community healing like hanging a pig. Meanwhile, ecclesiastical courts run by the church handled cases involving wild animals or pests, like locusts, mice, or weevils. If these creatures were damaging crops or property, they might be summoned to court, given a chance to vacate the area, and if they didn't comply, excommunicated. Yes, you heard that right. There are records of beetles being given legal warnings, rats being threatened with divine punishment, entire swarms of insects being put on spiritual notice. Here's the head-scratcher. These weren't jokes. These trials were real, recorded in court documents, with witnesses, verdicts, and punishments. So why? Were medieval people just deeply confused about how animals work? Not exactly. Scholars still debate the logic behind this bizarre practice, but several theories offer insight. Some see it as a form of symbolic justice, an attempt to restore social order after a traumatic event. A pig killing out a child wasn't just a tragedy, it was a disruption of the community's moral fabric. Executing the pig, however absurd it sounds to us, was a way of saying this act won't go unpunished. Others argue it was a legal necessity. Medieval law often treated animals as property, but there were moments when that line blurred, especially if the animal caused harm. By putting the pig on trial rather than punishing the owner directly, the court avoided setting messy precedents. It also reinforced the idea that even the lowliest creature was subject to divine and earthly law. Justice applied to all, no exceptions. Still, there's no denying the fringe factor here. In one 15th century French case, a sow and her piglets were put on trial for killing a boy. The sow was found guilty and executed, but the piglets were acquitted. Why? Because witnesses said the piglets were too young to understand the crime. That's some serious legal nuance for a group of confused baby pigs. Another case from 1314 involved a bull who killed a man. The bull was promptly sentenced to death and hanged. Try fitting that into your standard crime drama plotline. But animal trials weren't just limited to pigs and bulls. In 1519, in the town of Stelvio, now in northern Italy, legal proceedings were brought against a group of field mice for destroying grain. They were provided with legal counsel, and the defence argued that the mice had a right to the land. The court, in all seriousness, allowed the case to proceed. You can't make this stuff up, because medieval lawyers already did. Now here's where the scholarly debate gets tangled. Were these trials really about justice, or were they elaborate rituals, cultural performances dressed up in legal language? Some historians argue that these trials reflect a world where people saw everything, animals, weather, disease, as part of a divine order. When something went wrong, it wasn't random, it was moral, and so justice had to be visible, even theatrical. Others argue that these trials weren't taken quite as seriously as they appear in the records, that they were half legal, half symbolic spectacles meant to reinforce communal values more than actually prosecute misbehaving livestock. Either way, they reveal something important about the medieval worldview. The boundary between humans and animals wasn't always sharp. Animals were part of daily life, often living in close quarters with people. They had names, they had jobs, they had personalities. When if they broke the rules, it felt personal. A pig killing a child wasn't just a freak accident. It felt like betrayal. And sometimes the animals weren't punished. They were protected. In one famous case in the 15th century, some towns tried to have rats legally expelled from their territory. The rats didn't show up to court. Shocking, I know, but their legal counsel argued they had a right to safe passage and should be granted time to evacuate. In some records, the judge agreed. The rats were given several days' grace. I'd love to know if they used it. Here's your quirky detail. Animal defendants were sometimes given legal representation by trained lawyers. Imagine going through years of university, becoming fluent in Latin, and then being assigned to defend a rooster who allegedly laid a demonic egg. Yes, that happened. The egg was thought to be a sign of the devil. The rooster was burned at the stake. The lawyer presumably updated his resume shortly after. Tonight's hard historical fact. Medieval courts really did try animals, pigs, rats, insects and more. Sometimes even assigning them lawyers and holding formal trials. Your quirky fringe detail. In at least one case, piglets were acquitted of murder because they were too young to form intent. Somewhere, a medieval judge gave that verdict with a straight face, and the scholarly debate. Were animal trials acts of real jurisprudence, or ritualized performances meant to restore moral order and social cohesion? So next time someone tells you medieval people were unsophisticated, just remember, they had a legal system nuanced enough to acquit baby pigs and summon mice to court. And let's be honest, that's still more coherent than some modern legal headlines. Tonight, we're entering the halls of medieval art, where everything is apparently ugly, weird, or laughably bad. You've seen it. Lopsided babies who look like middle-aged tax collectors, saints with impossibly stiff fingers, cross-eyed lions, and Jesus riding what appears to be a space hopper disguised as a donkey. The myth is simple and brutal, that medieval art was just bad. No sense of anatomy, no grasp of perspective, no emotional depth, just flat, awkward, and deeply confused about what humans even look like. But surprise, medieval art wasn't bad, it was intentional, brilliant in its own language, and when you understand what it was trying to do, you realise it wasn't about realism, it was about meaning. So first things first, medieval artists could do realism, they just didn't care to, at least not the way Renaissance artists did. Before the 15th century, art wasn't about replicating the natural world, it was about expressing the spiritual world. If you were painting the Virgin Mary, you weren't trying to catch her best angle or show off her cheekbones. You were representing holiness, so you gave her a golden halo, an otherworldly expression, and maybe even elongated proportions. Her body wasn't supposed to look real, it was supposed to look sacred. And before you laugh at those bug-eyed angels, consider that their faces weren't drawn for viewers like us. They were for people who lived in a world where symbolism trumped realism. Take the famous ugly baby Jesus trope. You've probably seen him, a baby with a receding hairline, suspicious gaze, and the face of someone who already hates your playlist. But those weren't failed baby portraits. Artists often depicted Jesus as a small man, not a baby, to reflect the theological idea that he was fully divine from birth. Cuddly infant didn't express that power. A tiny adult did. Creepy? Maybe. But it wasn't incompetence, it was dogma. Now let's talk about proportions and perspective. Medieval art doesn't follow modern rules of vanishing points or light sources. Instead, it uses hieratic scale, where the most important figure is the biggest, not the one closest to you. So if Mary's taking up half the painting and the donor looks like a Lego man beside her, that's not a mistake, that's a status cue. You should notice her first. She's literally bigger than you on purpose. Perspective wasn't wrong, or it just wasn't the point. Here's your quirky fact for the night. Medieval manuscripts are full of marginalia, those weird little drawings in the margins of religious texts. And let me tell you, they are unhinged. You'll find rabbits stabbing knights, nuns riding fish, snails fighting armoured men, and monkeys doing questionable things with kitchen utensils. Why? Scholars still argue. Some say they were just doodles for fun. Others think they were moral commentary, political satire, or inside jokes from the scribe. But one thing's clear, medieval artists had a wild sense of humour, and they weren't afraid to sneak it into sacred texts. That's the thing about medieval art. It's not boring, it's not bland, it's vivid, even when it's strange. Look at the illuminated manuscripts. Gold leaf, vibrant blues made from lapis lazuli, reds from crushed beetles, greens from malachite. The colour palette alone would make any digital illustrator drool. And these weren't mass-produced images. They were handcrafted, often by monks or highly trained artisans, sometimes over months or even years. Pages weren't just decorated, they were celebrated. And the walls of churches, painted, carved, gilded. You walk into a cathedral today and see bare stone, but in its prime, that same cathedral would have been dripping with colour and symbolism. Saints stared down from rainbowed glass. Ceilings were star-spangled, columns were painted with vines and gold. Jesus wasn't just hovering in the background. He was 9 feet tall and surrounded by angels, flames, or cosmic wheels. The art wasn't minimal, it was maximalist with a mission. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. How much of medieval art was meant for elite audiences, and how much for the average viewer? Some argue that most people couldn't read the visual language of these pieces, the gestures, the attributes, the layered symbolism. Others believe that images in churches and books were carefully designed to be read even by the illiterate. A saint with a broken wheel must be St. Catherine, a dragon underfoot, probably St. George. Visual shorthand for sacred stories, like emojis, but with more halos and fewer poop jokes. Okay, some marginalia definitely includes poop jokes. And here's something else to consider. A lot of what looks strange to us now looked normal back then. The stylized faces, the odd proportions, the lack of shadows, that was the aesthetic. If you judged every anime drawing by the Renaissance standards, you'd think the artist failed anatomy. But the style has its own logic, so did medieval art. Let's not forget stained glass either. These weren't just decorative windows, they told stories. If you were a 12th century farmer who couldn't read Latin, you could still walk into your local cathedral and read the crucifixion, the nativity, the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, who, by the way, was grilled to death and allegedly told his executioners, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." And yes, he sometimes shows up in art holding a gridiron. Dark, absolutely, but also unforgettable. Even public sculpture had its say. Gargoyles, for example, weren't just spooky decorations, they were rain spouts and reminders of sin, demons, or the outside world's chaos. Some were comical, grotesque, or downright obscene. They didn't just ward off water. They warned or entertained visitors. It's medieval humour, carved in stone and staring at you with a tongue sticking out. Tonight's hard historical fact: medieval art wasn't bad. It was deliberate, symbolic, and often richly detailed, based on its own visual language and cultural logic. Your quirky detail, marginalia in religious texts include rabbits jousting, butt trumpets, and snails attacking knights, because why not? And the scholarly debate? Was medieval art designed for elite, educated viewers, or was it an accessible visual tool for a largely illiterate public? So next time someone mocks a medieval painting for being ugly, just smile and say, "Actually, that's theological symbolism with a dash of bunny knife fight. Show some respect." Tonight, let's crack our knuckles and lift the drawbridge on another classic misunderstanding. The myth that the Middle Ages were basically one giant intellectual blackout, that the fall of Rome flipped off the light switch of knowledge, and the world sat in darkness until someone named Leonardo decided to invent ideas again. You've probably heard it framed this way. After the Romans, people forgot how to read, how to build, how to do math. They thought the earth was flat and that bathing was witchcraft. But here's the reality. The so-called Dark Ages weren't nearly as dark as you've been led to believe. In fact, they were lit up with scholarship, invention, translation, and a whole lot more thinking than they get credit for. Let's start by killing the biggest, dumbest zombie of a myth, that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. Nope, not even a little bit. Educated folks in medieval Europe knew the earth was round. They'd known it for centuries thanks to thinkers like Ptolemy and the ancient Greeks, whose works were preserved and studied. Medieval scholars even calculated the earth's circumference with surprising accuracy. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas didn't pause to debate whether the earth was a disk or a sphere, because no one he was writing to would have questioned it. That flat earth myth? It's a 19th century invention, used to mock medieval people and make the Renaissance look cooler by contrast. And let's talk about those so-called lost books. Yes, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, and yes, a lot of chaos followed. Urban infrastructure declined, trade networks shrank, literacy levels dropped, especially among the general population. But the flame of learning never went out. It just moved and changed hands. In monasteries across Europe, monks copied ancient texts by hand, preserving works of Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, and Galen. These weren't just dusty libraries, they were the engines of knowledge preservation. Without the scribes of the early Middle Ages, half of classical antiquity would be lost to us today. Meanwhile, over in the Islamic world, things were absolutely booming. From the 8th to the 13th century, The Islamic Golden Age saw scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba translating Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic and building on them. Algebra, Arabic word, chemistry, developed and named in the Islamic world. Optics, medicine, astronomy, navigation, all made huge leaps thanks to scholars like Alhazen, Avicenna, and Al-Khwarizmi. And then, in the later Middle Ages, those texts were translated again, this time into Latin, and reintroduced to Western Europe through centres of learning in places like Sicily and Spain. So the so-called rediscovery of classical knowledge in the Renaissance, that wasn't a light bulb going on. It was a torch being passed. Here's a quirky detail for the night. In 12th century Paris, university students and professors engaged in heated debates over Aristotle's physics. These weren't dusty scholastics mumbling into scrolls. They were shouting, arguing, walking through town in academic robes, and occasionally getting into brawls. The medieval university wasn't a sleepy monastery. It was a battleground of ideas, full of sarcasm, theology, and sometimes fists. Students travelled between cities to hear different masters. Universities had textbooks, reading lists, and final exams. And yes, coffee houses came later, but these guys still knew how to pull all-nighters. A medieval science, alive and well. People tracked planetary movements, mapped the stars, and developed mechanical clocks. They studied medicine based on both classical and Islamic sources. They experimented with alchemy, sure, but alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was the precursor to chemistry. Alchemists recorded observations, tested materials, and made real discoveries about acids, solvents, and the properties of metals. A few of them probably did try to summon demons with mercury fumes, but hey, that's just grad school with extra steps. Let's not ignore the inventions either. The heavy plough, the horse collar, the windmill, eyeglasses, distillation, the spinning wheel, paper manufacturing, Gothic architecture with flying buttresses wasn't just pretty, it was advanced engineering. Cathedrals weren't built by people with no math skills. They were geometric marvels designed by master masons with generations of accumulated knowledge. Stained glass, precision chemistry with sand and fire. Even the humble mechanical clock emerged in medieval monasteries, driven by the need to track hours for prayers. And here's the scholarly debate. How accurate is the term Dark Ages? Some historians argue that it was always an oversimplification coined in the Renaissance to make humanists look smarter by contrast. Others acknowledge that certain regions of Europe did experience real decline after Rome's fall, economically, demographically, and technologically, but the modern trend in scholarship is to ditch the phrase altogether. Early Middle Ages is more accurate and less insulting. The darkness wasn't everywhere, and it wasn't constant. Some places were lit with libraries, universities, and scientific experimentation. Others were, well, probably still figuring out how to stop setting their fields on fire. Here's a little bonus fun. Medieval people loved logic, like loved it. They turned theology into a logic puzzle factory. A famous question from medieval scholars was, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Which people today mock, but actually, that was a real exercise in metaphysical space, not a dumb joke. They weren't wasting time, they were pushing the limits of what logic could do when applied to faith. Call it weird if you want, but it's the ancestor of quantum philosophy in its own strange way. So let's put this tired myth to bed. The Middle Ages were not an intellectual void. They were a bridge between ancient and modern thought, full of thinkers who preserved knowledge, adapted it, and created entirely new systems of understanding. Without medieval scholasticism, there's no Renaissance. Without Arabic translations, there's no revival of Aristotle. Without the monks and manuscripts, half the books in your local library wouldn't exist. Tonight's hard historical fact: the Dark Ages weren't universally dark. Medieval Europe preserved, adapted, and expanded upon ancient knowledge while new ideas flourished across the Islamic world and beyond. Your quirky fringe detail. Medieval students in Paris were known for rowdy intellectual debates that occasionally escalated into street brawls. Philosophy, but make it WE, and the scholarly debate. Is the term Dark Ages a misleading Renaissance invention, or does it still apply to specific post-Roman periods of decline? So the next time someone scoffs that medieval people were too dumb to know the earth was round, just hand them a copy of De Sphera Mundi and tell them they're about 800 years late to the party. Let's lace up your softest leather boots and step into another wildly misunderstood arena of medieval life: travel. If you picture medieval people as being born, living, and dying within 5 miles of their local pigsty, never seeing the world beyond their village hedgerow. You're not alone. That's the myth. Peasants chained to their dirt, nobles to their halls, and absolutely no badabdi going anywhere unless dragged off to war or crusade. But here's the twist. Yes, medieval travel was everywhere. The roads weren't always good, and the journeys weren't always safe, but people moved. Constantly, for trade, for work, for worship, for curiosity. The medieval world was more mobile than you think. Let's start with the big one. Pilgrimage. If there was one reason to lace up and hit the road in medieval Europe, it was to visit a holy site. People from every class, yes, including peasants, set out on pilgrimages that could take weeks, months, or even years. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Rome, Jerusalem. These weren't just spiritual quests, they were adventures. Pilgrims carried badges, wore travel cloaks, and often travelled in large groups for safety. Along the way, they'd stay at monasteries, hospitals, and inns that catered specifically to travellers. Think medieval Airbnbs, but with more incense and less Wi-Fi. And here's something fun. Pilgrims wrote about their travels. One of the most famous is Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century mystic and extremely chatty traveller from England. She made it all the way to the Holy Land and back, no small feat for a middle-aged mother with no noble title. And she wasn't alone. Monks, merchants, soldiers and scholars made similar journeys, often leaving behind records, maps and letters as describing what they saw. These weren't people afraid to leave home. They were out chasing experiences, ideas, relics, and maybe a bit of divine forgiveness. But it wasn't all saints and sandals. Trade routes connected cities across continents, and medieval Europe was buzzing with markets, fairs and merchant caravans. Think of places like Bruges, Venice and Constantinople, cosmopolitan centres drawing people from across Europe, Asia and North Africa. The Hanseatic League, a network of trading cities in Northern Europe, linked ports from London to Novgorod. If you were a wool trader in England or a spice merchant in Genoa, travel wasn't optional, it was your business model. You needed to get to fairs, ports and cities. You had ships to load, buyers to woo and cargo to haggle over. And people didn't just travel for religion or trade, some wandered in search of work. Journeymen, those skilled labourers in between apprentice and master, were expected to travel to gain experience. In the German-speaking world, this tradition even had a name, the waltz, where journeymen roamed the countryside for years, working under different masters, collecting techniques, and occasionally drinking too much at town festivals. You know, professional development with bonus sausages. Of course, there were dangers. Roads could be rough, robbers were real, and bridges could collapse under you with no warning. Weather could trap you for days in a leaky inn, and border crossings often meant bribing guards or arguing with tax collectors. Passports, sort of. Travellers sometimes carried letters of protection or badges identifying their purpose, especially pilgrims or messengers. But the idea of needing official permission to travel was more about status than geography. If you had a reason, some coin and a sturdy pair of boots, you could go pretty far. Here's your quirky fringe detail. One of the earliest known travel guides was written in the Middle Ages. It was called The Guide for the Pilgrim to Santiago de Compostela, compiled in the 12th century. It includes detailed routes, descriptions of towns, advice on local customs, warnings about which inns to avoid, and even restaurant recommendations, though those usually sounded like, "With the innkeeper who waters the wine and overcooks the lamb." Still, it's the medieval version of Lonely Planet, and it shows just how structured long-distance travel could be. And don't forget the Crusaders, tens of thousands of people from across Europe making their way to the Middle East over land and sea, sometimes for years. These journeys weren't just about battle, they were logistical operations on a massive scale, provisioning food, animals, ships, shelter. You weren't just marching into history, you were basically trying to backpack across multiple continents with a sword and questionable maps. Crusader routes passed through cities like Constantinople, Antioch and Acre, and along the way, travellers wrote home, traded goods, got married, and sometimes never came back. The scholarly debate here is fascinating. Just how mobile was the average person in medieval Europe? Some argue that yes, most people did stay local, that the cost, time and danger made travel rare. Others point to surviving records, pilgrimage badges found hundreds of miles from their origin, merchant logs, court records showing cross-regional movement, and argue that, while not everyone was Marco Polo, mobility was woven into medieval life more than we assume. It probably depended on your profession, your gender, your class, and your luck, but movement wasn't reserved for the elite. Speaking of polo, he gets a lot of credit for his travels to Asia, and rightfully so. But he wasn't the only one. Before him, Muslim traveller Ibn Battuta logged tens of thousands of miles across Africa, the Middle East, India and China. Jewish merchants like Benjamin of Tudela wrote about life in foreign lands. And let's not forget the Norse, who crossed the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland and even Vinland, possibly Newfoundland, centuries before Columbus set sail. Medieval people weren't afraid of the horizon, they chased it. And here's something to really fry your gypsy brain. There were postal systems. Not as fast or reliable as FedEx, sure, but monasteries, universities and royal courts had no networks for sending letters. Messengers travelled on foot, horseback and even boat, carrying everything from royal orders to love poems to shopping lists. The infrastructure existed, just a little slower and more prone to wolf attacks. Tonight's hard historical fact, and medieval people travelled far more than modern myths suggest, for trade, pilgrimage, work, diplomacy and exploration. Your quirky fringe detail, one of the world's earliest travel guides, written in the 1100s, warned pilgrims about bad food, shady innkeepers, and dangerous rivers. Some things never change, and the scholarly debate. Was medieval travel common enough to impact society broadly, or was it still the domain of the mobile minority? So next time someone insists medieval folks never left their village, just ask them how they think St. Thomas's toenail ended up in a cathedral 700 miles from where he died. Tonight, we're heading down a smoky, dimly lit path that leads straight to one of the most persistent and cinematic myths of the medieval world, that accused witches were routinely burned at the stake by the church during the Middle Ages. You know the image, village women tied to posts, angry mobs with torches, chanting priests and a dramatic fire lighting up the night as a witch screams her last. But here's the reality check. That whole scene, not really medieval, at least not early or high medieval. The big fiery witch hunts, the kind most people picture, are actually a Renaissance and early modern phenomenon. The Middle Ages had some weird moments, sure, but the great witch-burning frenzy, that came later. Let's clear this up first. Were there any witch trials in the Middle Ages? Yes. But they were rare, scattered, and usually focused on heretics, not witches in the spell-casting, cauldron-bubbling sense. The church in the early medieval period actually denied the existence of witchcraft as a real supernatural threat. That's right, the church didn't believe in witches, not the way you'd think. In 906, a document called the Canon Episcopi declared that women who believed they flew through the night with Diana, or other pagan goddesses, were deluded, victims of satanic deception, but not guilty of actual supernatural crimes. It was seen as a sin of belief, not action. So if you were accused of flying on a broomstick in, say, 1050, the church's response would have been something along the lines of, "That's nonsense, repent, go to confession," not "tie her up and get the firewood." Early medieval theology treated most witchcraft accusations as superstition, not proof of an evil conspiracy, and for the most part, civil authorities went along with that. There were exceptions, local panic, mob justice, fringe trials, but there was no systematic persecution. Not yet. That changed in the later Middle Ages, and especially in the 15th century. The shift had to do with a perfect storm of factors: fear of heresy, growing obsession with Satan as an active force in the world, political instability, economic crisis, and, let's be honest, deep-seated misogyny simmering in the vast cultural pot. By the late 1400s, the idea of the witch had evolved from lonely herbalist or superstitious neighbour into a full-blown satanic collaborator, part of a secret cabal threatening Christendom itself. And that's where things started getting, well, flammable. Enter one of the darkest books in European history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This charming little manual insisted that witches were real, that they were mostly women and that they should be hunted down and destroyed. It was packed with misogyny, theological gymnastics and frankly unhinged logic, but it spread like wildfire. It was printed over and over, becoming the de facto guide for how to detect, interrogate and eliminate witches, and it laid the groundwork for what became the Great Witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, well after the medieval period had technically ended. Here's the ironic twist. In much of the early Middle Ages, if you accused someone of witchcraft, you were the one in danger. The church frowned on making such accusations without cause, It saw belief in witchcraft as a lingering pagan superstition. So while folk magic absolutely existed, people cast love spells, made charms, used herbs and rituals, the official line was that supernatural power came only from God, and that anyone claiming otherwise was either deluded or dabbling in forbidden knowledge, but not necessarily some cackling force of evil. So where does that leave our beloved bonfires? They did happen, but usually later, and not always for witches. Heretics, rebels, and political enemies were sometimes burned. Joan of Arc, for example, was executed by burning in 1431, not specifically for witchcraft, but for heresy. And even then, her case was as much about politics as religion. She claimed divine visions, defied gender roles, and had the audacity to lead troops in battle. That was enough to get her labelled dangerous. But she wasn't alone in being accused of supernatural heresy, especially as the late medieval period veered into darker theological corners. Now, here's your quirky fringe fact. Not everyone feared witches. Some communities hired local wise women known as cunning folk or leeches to heal the sick, find lost items, or ward off curses. These people existed in a grey area. They weren't officially sanctioned by the church, but they were tolerated by communities that relied on them. Sometimes they were respected, sometimes envied, and occasionally they were scapegoated when things went wrong. A failed harvest, a sick child, a cow that dropped dead for no reason. But until the paranoia of the Renaissance, the response was usually more like social shunning than pyromania. The scholarly debate here is fiery. 2. How much of the witchcraft panic was driven by top-down institutional pressure, church courts, inquisitors, state law, and how much came from the ground up from frightened villagers pointing fingers? Some historians argue that local fears drove the first panics, especially in regions where folklore already framed misfortune as magical sabotage. Others say it was institutional paranoia that weaponized those fears, turning rumours into formal persecutions. The truth likely lies in a grim dance between the two, and if you're wondering where most witch burnings actually happened, look no further than early modern Germany and Switzerland, far outside the timeline of your average medieval history class. Between the 1500s and 1600s, thousands of people, mostly women, were executed in localised witch crazes. The infamous Salem trials, that was 1692, in colonial America. So the next time someone points to a medieval tapestry and says, "That's when they were burning witches," you can just smile and say, "Actually, wrong century, wrong continent." Tonight's hard historical fact: systematic witch burning wasn't a medieval practice. It rose in the Renaissance and peaked in the early modern period, long after the so-called Dark Ages. Your quirky fringe detail? In many medieval communities, folk healers and cunning women were respected and consulted, until the mood turned and superstition curdled into fear, and the scholarly debate, were the great witch hunts fueled more by institutional control or grassroots hysteria, and how much did theology, politics, and gender bias intertwine to fan the flames? So next time you hear that medieval people burned witches left and right, just lean in and whisper, "Wrong era, but let me tell you about the Malleus Maleficarum." It gets weird. Alright, let's ride this one home with a big, sweeping misconception that hangs over everything we've talked about so far, that the word medieval is basically just code for primitive. It's used as an insult all the time. That's medieval, people say, when describing something cruel, stupid, backward, or barbaric. And sure, there were some rough edges, public executions, plagues, the general absence of antibiotics, but the blanket idea that the Middle Ages were nothing but mud, murder, and misery is flat out wrong. In reality, the medieval world laid the groundwork for many of the institutions, ideas, and innovations we now claim as modern. It wasn't primitive, it was foundational. Let's start with something flashy. Cathedrals. You want to talk about engineering? Walk into a place like Chartres, Durham, or Milan and just look up. Those towering ceilings, stained glass windows, and vaulting arches didn't happen by accident. They required math, geometry, architectural theory, labour coordination, and, oh yes, money management. Building a cathedral took generations. Fundraising campaigns stretched for decades. Craftsmen travelled between job sites like freelance contractors, and those rose windows with all the tiny coloured panes? That was medieval chemistry and precision at work, not some crude guesswork with sand and hope. And what about universities? The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, Oxford, 1096, Cambridge, 1209. These were medieval inventions, structured institutions with curricula, degrees and rules. They studied law, theology, medicine and the liberal arts. They argued, a lot, and sometimes they rioted. But they also preserved and advanced knowledge. The very idea of higher education as we know it, it's medieval. You can thank a bunch of robe-wearing, ink-stained logicians with too many opinions and not enough sleep. Then there's the legal system. Trial by jury, property rights, written contracts, medieval foundations. Sure, justice wasn't perfect, ask anyone who had to survive a feud or got dunked in a river to prove their innocence. But codified law was spreading. Legal documents were written, copied, archived. Royal courts emerged. Precedents were set. Towns developed charters and councils. It wasn't a free-for-all. It was a slow build toward the systems we still navigate today. And let's not forget literature and storytelling. The medieval world gave us Beowulf, the Divine Comedy, the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, and the Song of Roland. Yes, the language might be dense, but the themes still hits. Love, death, honour, betrayal, fart jokes. Chaucer could have written for Netflix. And if you think medieval people didn't enjoy entertainment, just look at the travelling minstrels, court jesters, miracle plays, tournaments and festivals. Life was hard, but it was not all solemn chanting and gloom. It had colour, song, and more than a few drunken saints' days. Here's your quirky fringe detail. In medieval Iceland, if you wanted to insult someone properly, you'd compose a need, a nasty poem that publicly shamed them. These weren't just personal attacks, they could legally damage someone's honour and had to be answered. The right verse, delivered at the right moment, could spark a feud or ruin a reputation. Poetry had power, sometimes more than swords. And about those swords? Weapon making in the Middle Ages was no joke. Damascus steel, pattern welding, advanced metallurgy. It wasn't just bashing metal with a hammer. It was skilled craftsmanship. Armour too. By the 14th century, full-plate armour was a marvel of engineering. Protective, flexible and often custom fit. These weren't tin cans with eye holes. They were high-tech battle suits, tailored for both survival and swagger. And don't even get us started on medicine. Was there some weird stuff? Sure. But there was also surgical technique, herbal medicine, battlefield triage, and hospital systems run by monastic orders. The idea of caring for the sick as a moral duty, that was rooted in medieval Christian practice. Hospitals weren't sterile by modern standards, but they were organised, staffed, and often shockingly clean for the time. In some cases, monks wrote detailed medical treatises based on ancient and Arabic sources. The stethoscope may have come later, but the patient charts, already in motion. The scholarly debate here? It's about whether we should even use medieval as a pejorative anymore. Many historians argue that the term has been unfairly twisted by Enlightenment and Victorian thinkers who wanted to elevate their own age by bashing the past. In doing so, they flattened centuries of cultural complexity into a convenient insult. It's like calling an entire era dumb because it didn't have Netflix. If anything, we're the ones getting lazy with our labels. Let's also acknowledge how much medieval culture survives in subtle ways. The layout of European cities, the names of the days, the university gown, the legal language we still use, that weird affection for dragons in pop culture, that's pure medieval romance fiction, still roaring through our collective imagination. And our obsession with chivalry, honour, quests, and even fantasy tropes, all soaked in medieval ink. Tonight's hard historical fact. The Middle Ages weren't primitive, they were dynamic, creative, and vital to the development of the modern world. Your quirky fringe detail? In medieval Iceland, an insult poem could legally damage your reputation, and sometimes needed poetic rebuttal to restore it. Bars were being spit before it was cool, and the scholarly debate? Should we stop using medieval as shorthand for barbaric, given how much the era actually accomplished? So the next time someone rolls their eyes and says, "That's so medieval," and feel free to gently remind them that without the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have universities, cathedrals, contracts, or even the word modern. And now, as the final embers of our torchlit journey flicker out, and your brain, hopefully not charred by medieval trivia, settles into that warm hum of almost sleep, let's take one last slow lap around everything we've uncovered tonight. Because if there's one thing this sprawling trip through misunderstood history has shown us, it's that the past is rarely what we were told. The Middle Ages weren't a monolith of filth, fire and foolishness. They were alive, complex and, honestly, a little too relatable at times. We saw that peasants didn't live exclusively in slop and sorrow, that the streets weren't always filled with sewage and ignorance, and that food had spice, colour, and far more flavour than grey oatmeal and mystery stew. We met knights who weren't always noble, castles that weren't drafty rock boxes, and women who weren't all locked in towers waiting to be rescued. They were nuns, traders, rulers, and revolutionaries. We burned the horned Viking helmet myth to the ground without using a longboat, corrected a few tomato time-travelling errors, and even stood in on a trial where a pig needed legal defence. We read Backward Art Forward. We walked the Pilgrim's Road, and we politely told the Renaissance to sit down and stop pretending it invented thinking. The truth is, the Middle Ages weren't some dark pit we climbed out of. They were the foundations under our feet. Messy foundations, sure, sometimes bloody, occasionally baffling, and always a little unpredictable. But they held more than superstition and soot. They held learning, light, legacy. They held laughter and lore and people just trying to figure things out with whatever they had. Scrolls, ploughs, swords, or just a very firm belief that angels could dance on pins. And now that you know all this, what will you do with it? Maybe next time someone shrugs off the medieval world with a joke or an eye roll, you'll offer a quiet correction or a very loud one, depending on your caffeine levels. Maybe you'll look at a cathedral and think not just pretty, but impossible without math. Maybe you'll remember that 1,000 years of human life doesn't deserve to be filed under oops. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll go to sleep tonight with a new kind of dream. One where a Viking with a clean beard and a hornless helmet walks into a bustling medieval inn, orders a plate of spice-rubbed duck, and gets into a legal debate with a literate pig. Thank you for sticking with me through this long, winding journey. I hope you laughed, learned something new, and found a bit of wonder tucked in between the myths. Now dim whatever lights are still on, let the fan hum like a lullaby, and sink into sleep knowing that the past isn't as wrong as it looks. It's just waiting for someone like you to ask better questions.